This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of two highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis Detwiler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency. Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. Imagine having your entire life ahead of you with loving parents, great friends, and a bright future in a creative field you love, only to suddenly drift into a series of bizarre actions that no one can explain. This is the story of Bryce Laspisa, a 19-year-old college student whose life seemed almost perfect on the surface, but ended up becoming one of the most hotly debated and baffling mysteries in modern American history. To really understand what happened, we have to look at who Bryce was before everything changed. They settled down in Laguna Niguel, California, which is an upscale, exceptionally quiet suburb in Orange County, known for its pristine streets, manicured lawns, and incredibly safe neighborhoods. It is the kind of place where parents feel comfortable raising their families, and Mike and Karen Laspisa had poured all of their love, energy, and resources into their only child, Bryce. He was their pride and joy, their entire world. As Bryce grew up, he was an active, happy kid. He spent his days skateboarding, hanging out with friends, and showing an incredible natural talent for art. His parents noticed early on that Bryce had a unique way of looking at the world. He was not just drawing doodles, he was creating complex figures and designs that showed a mature grasp of space and color. By the time he was in high school, he had transitioned from traditional paper and pencils to digital mediums, mastering graphic design programs with ease. He could spend hours in front of his computer screen, completely lost in his creations. Mike and Karen encouraged his passion and supported his dream of pursuing a career in graphic design. When he graduated from high school, they helped him look for the perfect college, and they settled on Sierra College in Rocklin, California, which is located in Placer County just outside of Sacramento. The school had an outstanding graphic design program and a welcoming campus community, which made it the ideal place for Bryce to start his adult life. In the summer of 2013, Bryce returned home to Laguna Niguel to spend the break with his parents. He had just finished his freshman year, and he was doing exceptionally well. During his first year at Sierra College, Bryce had made a lot of friends. He was living in an off-campus apartment with a great roommate named Sean, and he had started dating a wonderful, caring girl named Kim. Bryce and Kim were deeply in love, and their relationship was strong. To Mike and Karen, it seemed like their son was truly living his best life and was on a clear path to success. He was happy, healthy, and excited about his future. In mid-August of 2013, the summer was coming to an end, and it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College to start his sophomore year. Mike and Karen helped their beloved son pack up all of his belongings into the family car, a silver 2003 Toyota Highlander. Once the trunk was loaded with clothes, books, and his art supplies, all three of them hopped inside and made the long 7-hour drive north to the campus in Rocklin. The drive was a familiar routine, and the atmosphere in the car was light and optimistic. They talked about his upcoming classes, his artistic projects, and his plans for the new school year. Once they arrived in Rocklin, Mike and Karen helped Bryce move into his apartment, organizing his clothes, setting up his computer workstation, and making sure he had everything he needed. When it was time to say goodbye, they gave him big hugs and kisses, wished him luck for the semester, and told him how much they loved him. On their drive back down to Laguna Niguel, Mike and Karen talked about how proud they were of Bryce and how secure they felt knowing he was doing so well. But the problem was, this peaceful reality would not last. Just a couple of days after his parents dropped him off, those closest to Bryce began to notice a drastic and alarming change in his behavior. It started when his roommate Sean and his girlfriend Kim noticed that Bryce was acting very erratically. Specifically, he began drinking massive quantities of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was not a complete saint, and like many college kids his age, he liked to party and drink occasionally. But the sheer volume of alcohol he was consuming now was different. It was dark, heavy drinking, and it seemed to serve a purpose other than just having fun. Along with the heavy drinking, Bryce had also started experimenting with a powerful prescription stimulant called Vyvanse. Vyvanse is normally prescribed to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but Bryce did not have this condition. He was taking the drug illegally, using it to stay awake for days at a time so he could play video games and avoid sleeping. The combination of intense sleep deprivation, heavy alcohol consumption, and a powerful stimulant began to take a massive toll on Bryce's physical and mental health. His personality began to morph right before the eyes of his friends. He went from being a relaxed, friendly, and creative young man to someone who was constantly anxious, skittish, and intensely paranoid. He would pace around the apartment, looking over his shoulder, and acting as if some unseen danger was looming over him. Sean and Kim tried to confront him about this sudden change. They asked him what was going on, why he was drinking so much, and why he was taking these drugs. But Bryce would always brush them off, saying that nothing was wrong and that he was just doing what he wanted to do. He insisted it was not a big deal. Sean and Kim were not convinced. They knew Bryce, and they could tell that he was trying to numb himself or cope with some deep, hidden stressor that he refused to talk about. And so, things continued to spiral. By August 28th, which was about 2 weeks after his parents had moved him back to school, the situation reached a critical breaking point. Bryce and Sean were alone in their apartment, sitting in the living room. It was a normal afternoon, but the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Suddenly, Bryce looked at Sean and said he wanted to give him something. He reached up, took his diamond earrings out of his ears, and handed them to Sean. Sean was completely stunned. He knew these earrings were incredibly valuable, and more importantly, they were a gift from Bryce's mother, Karen. Sean tried to refuse, telling Bryce that he could not accept them because they meant too much to him and his family. But Bryce insisted, telling Sean that he wanted him to have them. Before Sean could even process this strange gesture, Bryce stood up, grabbed his Xbox video game console, placed it on the table in front of Sean, and told him to take that as well. At this point, Sean was deeply alarmed. Giving away valuable, personal belongings is a well-known warning sign that someone might be planning to harm themselves or end their life. Sean tried to ask Bryce what was going on, but Bryce ignored the questions and pulled out his phone. He began aggressively and frantically texting someone, his fingers flying across the screen with an intense, frantic energy. After a few minutes of this, Bryce looked up from his screen and coldly told Sean that he had just broken up with Kim. This piece of news made absolutely no sense to Sean. Bryce and Kim were deeply in love, they doted on each other constantly, and they had just been hanging out earlier that day with no signs of trouble. This sudden text message breakup felt impulsive, chaotic, and completely wrong. Sean realized that Bryce was in the middle of some sort of mental health crisis, and he knew he could not handle this situation alone. He needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents immediately. However, he did not want to call them right in front of Bryce and risk angering him, so Sean waited. Soon after the breakup text, Bryce announced that he was going to drive over to Kim's apartment, which was a short distance away, to talk to her. As soon as Bryce walked out the door, Sean grabbed his phone and called Karen Laspisa. When Karen answered, Sean explained everything that had been happening over the past 2 weeks. He told her about the heavy drinking, the Vyvanse abuse, the paranoia, and how Bryce had just given away his diamond earrings and his Xbox before abruptly breaking up with Kim. Sean emphasized that he was not trying to get Bryce in trouble, but he was genuinely terrified for his friend's safety and felt that his parents needed to step in and do something. Karen was shocked and deeply alarmed by this phone call. She had no idea her son was struggling with substance abuse or acting this way. She thanked Sean for his honesty and promised to reach out to Bryce immediately. But before Karen could even dial her son's number, her phone rang. It was Kim, Bryce's now ex-girlfriend. Kim was crying and sounding incredibly distressed. She told Karen that Bryce had just arrived at her apartment and he was acting so bizarrely and erratically that she was terrified to let him drive. Kim said she had actually managed to take his car keys away from him because she felt he was in no mental state to be operating a vehicle. She described Bryce as looking completely blank, staring right through her and speaking in a way that did not make any sense. Karen's heart sank. She now had 2 separate independent phone calls from the people closest to her son, both saying the exact same thing. Bryce was losing his grip on reality. Karen desperately asked Kim to put Bryce on the phone. When Bryce finally answered, his voice sounded surprisingly calm and normal, which only made the situation more confusing. Karen asked him what was going on, why his friends were so worried, and why he was at Kim's apartment acting so strangely. Bryce told his mother that Kim was just upset because they had broken up and that she was exaggerating his behavior. He said it was just a messy breakup and that he simply wanted to go back to his own apartment, but Kim was refusing to give him his car keys. He begged his mother to tell Kim to return his keys so he could just leave. Karen was torn. She knew her son was likely downplaying the situation, and she felt a deep sense of dread. She told Bryce that she was going to book a flight and fly up to Rockland first thing the next morning to see him in person and help him. But as soon as she said this, Bryce's demeanor changed. He became incredibly intense and told her absolutely not. He said he had a lot to talk to her about, but he insisted that she must not come up there until they had that conversation. Karen asked him what he needed to talk about, but Bryce refused to elaborate, saying only that they would talk later. This cryptic refusal to explain himself was highly uncharacteristic of Bryce, who had always been very open and honest with his parents. Feeling desperate, Karen handed the phone to her husband, Mike, hoping he could get through to their son. Mike spoke to Bryce, asking him if he was okay and what was happening. Bryce repeated the same story, claiming he had just broken up with his girlfriend and needed his keys so he could go home. From Mike's perspective, Bryce sounded completely coherent and calm. Mike believed that perhaps the situation was just a typical emotional reaction to a difficult breakup, and that his friends might be overreacting out of concern. Mike told Karen that they should probably just have Kim give Bryce his keys back so he could go to sleep in his own bed and they could sort everything out the next day. Reluctantly, Karen agreed. She got back on the phone, spoke with Kim, and asked her to return the keys to Bryce. Kim complied, and Bryce left her apartment. At around 11:30 that night, Karen called Bryce one more time to check on him. He was in his car, and she told him to go straight home and to call her the moment he walked through his apartment door so she would know he was safe. Bryce promised he would. At about 1 o'clock in the morning on August 29th, Bryce called his mother back and told her that he was safe inside his apartment. Karen and Mike breathed a massive sigh of relief, told their son they loved him, and went to sleep, believing the crisis had passed. But the next morning, the nightmare truly began. At around 11 o'clock on the morning of August 29th, Karen's phone rang. It was an automated notification from their insurance company letting them know that roadside assistance had been dispatched to their 2003 Toyota Highlander, which was the car Bryce was driving. Karen was immediately confused and worried. Bryce was supposed to be asleep in his apartment in Rockland. Why would he need roadside assistance? She tried calling Bryce, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She then called his roommate, Sean, to see if Bryce was still asleep. When Sean answered, he delivered a devastating piece of news. Bryce was not there, and he had never actually come home the previous night. The phone call at 1 in the morning, where Bryce had assured his mother he was safe in his apartment, had been a complete lie. Panicking, Mike and Karen realized they had to find their son. They decided to log into their online banking account to see if Bryce had used the credit card they had given him for emergencies, hoping to track his movements. Sure enough, they saw a very recent transaction from earlier that morning. It was a charge at an auto repair shop in a tiny town called Buttonwillow, California. Buttonwillow is a small, dusty desert community located right off Interstate 5, about halfway between Sierra College in Rocklin and their home in Laguna Niguel. This meant that instead of going home to his apartment, Bryce had got into his car and started driving south towards his parents' house. It seemed he was trying to make the 7-hour drive to see them in person, likely to talk about whatever mysterious burden he was carrying. But something had gone wrong along the way in Buttonwillow. Karen immediately called the auto repair shop listed on the bank statement. A mechanic named Christian answered the phone. Karen explained who she was and asked if he had seen a 19-year-old red-haired boy driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. Christian confirmed that he had indeed helped Bryce just a couple of hours earlier. Christian explained that Bryce had called for roadside assistance because his car had run completely out of gas on the highway. Christian had driven out to a rest stop where Bryce had pulled over, delivered 3 gallons of fuel, and charged the card. Karen asked if Bryce had mentioned where he was going, but Christian said they had barely spoken. He had simply delivered the gas and left. However, Christian was a kind and empathetic man. Seeing how frantic and terrified Karen was on the phone, he offered to drive back out to the rest stop, which was about 15 minutes away, to see if Bryce was still there, even though it had been hours since their encounter. Karen was incredibly grateful and accepted his offer. Christian got into his truck and drove to the rest stop. He did not expect to find the young man still there, as anyone who had run out of gas would usually continue their journey once they had fuel. But when Christian pulled into the rest stop parking lot, he was shocked to see the silver Toyota Highlander still parked there. Christian walked up to the driver's side window and looked inside. Bryce was sitting in the driver's seat, his hands on the steering wheel, staring completely blankly out the windshield into the empty desert landscape. He looked like he was in a trance. Christian knocked on the window, which startled Bryce. He rolled the window down, and Christian told him that his parents were worried sick and that he needed to speak with them. Christian dialed Karen's number on his own phone and handed it to Bryce. When Karen heard her son's voice, she was overwhelmed with emotion and confusion. She demanded to know what he was doing, why he was just sitting in a rest stop in Buttonwillow instead of driving home or going back to school. Bryce had no real explanation. He spoke in flat, monosyllabic answers, saying he was not doing anything and was just sitting there. Karen, realizing that her son was in some sort of mental paralysis, begged him to go fill his tank with gas and drive the remaining 3 hours home to Laguna Niguel. Bryce agreed, saying he would do that right away. He handed the phone back to Christian, who assured Karen that he would make sure Bryce got on his way. Christian watched as Bryce started his engine, but as Christian drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and noticed that Bryce did not actually pull out of the parking spot. He just turned the engine off and went back to staring out the window. Christian felt uneasy, but he had his own work to do, so he returned to his shop. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Bryce had still not arrived at his parents' house, and the drive from Buttonwillow should have only taken about 3 hours. Karen and Mike tried calling his phone repeatedly, but it rang and went to voicemail every single time. They were now completely consumed by fear. They waited, hoping against hope that he was just stuck in heavy Southern California traffic. But by 6 o'clock that evening, with still no sign of Bryce and no answer on his phone, they decided they could no longer wait. They called the police and officially reported Bryce Laspisa as a missing person. The police began their investigation by contacting AT&T to run an emergency ping on Bryce's cell phone. They wanted to pinpoint his exact coordinates using nearby cell towers. When the results came back, everyone was stunned. Bryce's phone was still in Buttonwillow, California. It had barely moved. It was now pinging in the parking lot of a local hotel just a few miles away from the rest stop where Christian had found him hours earlier. The local sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the hotel parking lot to locate the vehicle and check on Bryce. When the deputies arrived, they found the Toyota Highlander parked in the middle of the lot. Just as before, Bryce was sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. The deputies approached the car, knocked on the window, and asked Bryce to step out. To their surprise, Bryce was completely cooperative. He was polite, friendly, and spoke clearly. He did not appear to be under the influence of any substances. The deputies conducted a series of field sobriety tests, which Bryce passed with ease. They asked him if they could search his vehicle, and Bryce calmly gave them permission. The deputies thoroughly searched the SUV, but they found absolutely no drugs, no alcohol, and nothing illegal or suspicious. When they asked Bryce what he was doing, just sitting in a parking lot all day, he shrugged and said he was just passing the time and resting. The deputies realized that while Bryce was acting strangely by sitting in a parking lot for hours, he was an adult, he was sober, and he had not committed any crime. They could not legally detain him. However, they knew his parents had filed a missing persons report and were terrified. One of the deputies told Bryce that he needed to call his mother right then and there to let her know he was okay. Bryce became visibly reluctant and anxious, showing a strong aversion to speaking with his parents. But the deputy insisted, and Bryce finally dialed his mother's number. As soon as the call connected, the deputy took the phone from Bryce's hand. The deputy spoke to Karen, telling her that he was standing with her son, that Bryce was completely sober, healthy, and cooperative. He explained that they had searched his car and found nothing wrong, and that they had no legal reason to hold him. The deputy then handed the phone back to Bryce so he could speak to his mother. Karen, desperate and confused, asked Bryce why he was still in Buttonwillow after all this time. Bryce offered no real answers, only saying he would be home soon and that she should not worry. Karen, realizing she could not force him to explain himself over the phone, pleaded with him to just get some food, buy a cup of coffee, and drive home. Bryce agreed, promising her that he would make the drive. The deputies, satisfied that Bryce was safe and had promised to go home, wished him luck and left the scene. An hour later, Christian, the mechanic, called Karen back to see if Bryce had made it home. When Karen told him that Bryce had actually spent the whole day in Buttonwillow and had just been visited by the police, Christian was deeply concerned. He volunteered to drive back to the hotel parking lot to make sure Bryce had actually left this time. Karen told him it was not necessary, but Christian felt a strong pull to help. He drove over to the hotel, and to his frustration, he found Bryce still parked in the exact same spot, staring into the darkness. This time, Christian did not sugarcoat things. He parked his truck, walked up to Bryce's window, and told him in a very firm, commanding voice that he needed to go home. He told Bryce that his behavior was hurting his parents and that he was going to stand there and watch him pull out of the lot and that he was going to follow him to make sure he got onto the highway. Bryce, perhaps realizing he had no other choice, started his car and finally pulled out of the parking lot. Christian got into his truck and followed close behind. He watched as Bryce navigated the streets and successfully merged onto Interstate 5 South, heading toward Laguna Niguel. Christian followed the silver SUV for several miles, watching it maintain a steady speed and drive perfectly normally. Feeling satisfied that Bryce was finally on his way home, Christian pulled up alongside him, waved goodbye, and then took the exit to head back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after Christian left, Karen called Bryce to keep him awake and monitor his progress. She told him that she wanted him to describe the road signs and landmarks he was passing so she could track his journey and know he was getting closer. But Bryce refused. He told her that it was too dark, that he could not see anything out his windows, and that he did not know where he was. This made no sense, as Interstate 5 is heavily marked with massive, reflective green sign. Karen and Mike grew increasingly frustrated and worried by his evasiveness, but Bryce remained tight-lipped. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on August 30th, Bryce called his parents. He told them that he was incredibly tired and could not keep his eyes open. He said he was going to pull off the highway to take a nap in his car and would resume the drive as soon as he rested. Karen and Mike, knowing their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours and had been through an incredibly stressful couple of days, realized it was safer for him to sleep than to risk falling asleep at the wheel. They told him to pull over in a safe, well-lit area, sleep for a few hours, and call them the absolute moment he woke up. Bryce promised he would, and they hung up. This was the last time Karen and Mike Laspisa would ever speak to their son. By 8 o'clock that morning, Karen and Mike had still not received a call. They tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They tried to comfort themselves by thinking that he was just exhausted and sleeping deeply. But their hope was shattered when the doorbell rang. When Mike opened the door, he was met by a police officer. The officer asked if they were the owners of a 2003 Toyota Highlander. When Mike confirmed they were and that their son Bryce was driving it, the officer delivered a devastating blow. The vehicle had been found hours earlier, crashed at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is a large reservoir located in the mountains just off Interstate 5, about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. The details of the crash scene were incredibly baffling and deeply unsettling. The SUV was lying on its side at the bottom of the ravine. The emergency response team had searched the vehicle and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of Bryce. There was no driver, no body, and no immediate indication of where he had gone. Inside the vehicle, investigators found his cell phone and his laptop. On the road above the cliff, they found his wallet and his duffel bag, which contained his clothes. It appeared that these items had been thoroughly rummaged through, as if someone had been looking for something specific before abandoning them. The rear window of the SUV had been shattered from the inside, and there were 2 small drops of blood on the interior of the car, suggesting that Bryce had survived the crash with minor injuries and had crawled out through the broken back window to escape the wreckage. But the most disturbing revelation came from the physical evidence of the crash itself. Investigators analyzed the tire tracks on the dirt road leading up to the cliff's edge. There were no skid marks, which meant Bryce had never hit the brakes. In fact, traffic cameras and forensic analysis of the vehicle's computer revealed that Bryce had actually accelerated right before going over the edge. He had intentionally driven his car off the cliff. To the investigators, this looked like a clear-cut, tragic case of a failed suicide attempt. They theorized that Bryce, overwhelmed by whatever mental health crisis or secret he was harboring, had driven to Castaic Lake, accelerated off the cliff to end his life, survived the impact with minor injuries, and then, in a state of shock or desperation, walked into the deep waters of the lake and drowned. But Mike and Karen could not accept this theory. It did not align with the son they knew. Just 2 weeks earlier, Bryce had been happy, excited for his sophomore year, and full of plans for the future. He had a supportive family, a girlfriend who cared for him, and a passion for his art. Suicide seemed completely out of character. They began to wonder if Bryce had gotten himself involved in something dangerous during those 2 weeks back at school. What did he mean when he told his mother that he had a lot to talk to her about, but that she must not come up to see him until they did? Was he running from someone? Was he being threatened? Did the rummage through duffel bag and wallet suggest that someone else had been at the crash scene? A massive, unprecedented search operation was launched around Castaic Lake and the rugged terrain surrounding the crash site. For days, hundreds of search and rescue volunteers, police officers on horseback, ATVs, and foot combed the brush. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew overhead, and dive teams searched the dark, murky depths of Castaic Lake. Despite their exhaustive efforts, they found absolutely no trace of Bryce. No clothing, no footprints, no body. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. On the 9th day of the search, investigators decided to bring in a specialized bloodhound to see if it could pick up a scent trail from the crash site. The dog was given an article of Bryce's clothing to sniff. Immediately, the bloodhound caught the scent at the wreckage of the Highlander. It began to lead its handler down the steep ravine away from the road and straight toward the shoreline of Castaic Lake. The dog then followed the shoreline until it reached a massive concrete dam and bridge that spanned across the water. It crossed the bridge, its nose glued to the ground, and continued down a dirt access road on the other side. The scent trail led all the way to a busy truck stop located near the highway. And then, right in the middle of the truck stop parking lot, the bloodhound stopped. It began circling, indicating that the scent trail had gone completely cold. The investigators were stunned. To ensure this was not a mistake or a false lead, they brought in a second, completely independent bloodhound that had not been involved in the first search. This second dog was given Bryce's scent, and it proceeded to follow the exact same path. It went from the crash site down to the lake, across the dam and bridge, down the access road, and directly to the truck stop, where it also stopped. This physical evidence completely shattered the simple suicide by drowning theory. Bryce had survived the crash, climbed up the ravine, walked a significant distance around the lake, crossed the bridge, made his way to a truck stop, and from there his scent vanished. This strongly suggested that he had gotten into a vehicle either by hitchhiking, being picked up by someone he knew, or perhaps being abducted. Despite this incredible breakthrough, the lead went completely cold. Investigators checked the surveillance cameras at the truck stop, but they were of low quality and did not show anyone matching Bryce's description getting into a truck or car. There were no records of hitchhikers being picked up, and none of his friends or family had been contacted by him. After 3 weeks of intensive searching and investigation with no new leads and no sign of life, the official search for Bryce Laspisa was called off. In the years since his disappearance, several prominent theories have emerged, each trying to make sense of the bizarre and contradictory evidence. The first theory is that Bryce was indeed experiencing a severe, drug-induced psychotic break. The combination of heavy alcohol consumption, extreme sleep deprivation, and the abuse of Vyvanse can trigger acute psychosis, paranoia, and delusions in young adults. Proponents of this theory believe that Bryce's erratic behavior, his refusal to go home, his long periods of sitting in parking lots staring into space, and his decision to drive off the cliff were all the result of a complete loss of touch with reality. They suggest that after surviving the crash, confused, disoriented, and perhaps suffering from a traumatic brain injury or amnesia, he wandered away, reached the truck stop, and either hopped onto a truck or wandered into the wilderness where he eventually perished, or is living as an unidentified person, unaware of his own identity. The second theory is that Bryce intentionally staged his disappearance to start a new life off the grid. According to this theory, Bryce was facing some immense secret pressure or trouble that he felt he could not escape or face his parents with. Perhaps he had run into financial trouble, was involved in illegal activities, or simply wanted to escape the expectations of his life. By giving away his prized possessions, breaking up with his girlfriend, and driving off a cliff, he may have been trying to make everyone believe he was dead so that no one would look for him. He then walked to the truck stop, caught a ride with a long-haul trucker, and fled to another part of the country to start over with a new identity. However, his parents strongly reject this idea, stating that Bryce loved his family deeply and would never subject them to the agonizing, endless pain of not knowing if their only child is alive or dead. The third, and perhaps most sinister theory, is that Bryce was a victim of foul play. Supporters of this theory point to the rummaged-through duffel bag and wallet found on the road above the crash site. They suggest that Bryce may have been running from someone or trying to meet someone in Buttonwillow, which would explain his reluctance to leave that small town. Perhaps he was being followed, and the crash was not a suicide attempt, but the result of him being chased off the road. They believe that after he escaped the wreckage, he was intercepted by those who were pursuing him, or perhaps he met a dangerous individual at the truck stop who took advantage of his vulnerable, injured state, leading to his demise. For Mike and Karen Laspisa, the passage of time has brought no peace, only a lingering, heavy silence filled with unanswered questions. They have spent over a decade searching for their son, keeping his story alive in the media and hoping for a miracle. Every day, they are forced to live with the haunting memory of those final, agonizing phone calls, wondering what it was that Bryce so desperately needed to tell them and why he could not just make it home. The silver Toyota Highlander at the bottom of the cliff remains a tragic monument to a young life interrupted, and the silent waters of Castaic Lake hold their secrets close. To this day, the case of Bryce Laspisa remains open, but the physical trail has gone completely cold. There are no active search parties in the mountains, no new scent tracks for the bloodhounds to follow, and no fresh credit card transactions to trace. What started as a promising college sophomore preparing for his future dissolved over the course of 2 weeks into an absolute mystery. Every small town along Interstate 5, every rest stop, every dusty parking lot where Bryce sat staring into space serves as a quiet reminder of those final hours. Investigators still look at the case files, hoping that one day a new witness will come forward, or that someone who was at that Buttonwillow truck stop on the morning of August 30th, 2013, will remember seeing a 19-year-old red-haired boy with a unique tattoo looking lost and disoriented. The impact of Bryce's disappearance on his family is immeasurable. Mike and Karen have dedicated their lives to finding answers, creating social media pages, speaking to news outlets, and working with private investigators. They have had to navigate the cruel duality of holding on to hope while simultaneously facing the stark reality of the crash scene and the cliff. They often look back at the photos taken during that summer of 2013 when Bryce was laughing, painting, and enjoying his time in Laguna Niguel. They ask themselves what they could have done differently, if there were subtle signs they missed, or if there was some way they could have prevented him from making that final, fateful drive. But as the years turn into decades, the silence only grows louder. The mystery of what Bryce wanted to talk to his mother about remains the central, unresolved riddle of the entire tragedy. It is the key that could unlock everything, explaining his sudden paranoia, his erratic behavior, his gifts to his roommate, and his reluctance to return home. It is a secret that Bryce took with him when he climbed out of the shattered back window of his Highlander and walked down the access road toward the truck stop. The story of Bryce Laspisa is a cautionary tale about how quickly a life can change, how fragile our sense of security can be, and how some secrets are so heavy they can pull a person completely off their course. It is a narrative that continues to capture the imagination of millions of people around the world, all hoping that one day the truth will finally be revealed and that Mike and Karen will finally get the peace and the answers they have been desperately searching for. Until that day comes, Bryce remains a shadow on the highway, a memory of a red-haired boy who drove into the California desert and vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but questions, a broken car, and a trail of scent that stopped at a truck stop parking lot. If you or anyone you know has any information regarding the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, investigators urge you to contact the local authorities. Even the smallest detail, a remembered face from a truck stop, a conversation on the road, or a sighting in a different state, could be the final piece of the puzzle that brings Bryce home and provides closure to a family that has suffered for far too long. The mystery of that August night continues to linger, suspended in the dry air of the Central Valley, waiting for the day the silence is finally broken. More than a decade later, no one knows what really happened to Bryce Laspisa. And perhaps the most concerning part is that whatever he needed to say to his parents that night, he never had the chance to say it. Let me know your theory in the comments, as this case still feels unresolved. A relaxed pace of life may be found in the little town of Osborne, Idaho, in the state of Idaho. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone else, and the routine of daily life is determined by the gentle rhythm of the changing of the seasons. A thick covering of immaculate white snow encompasses the area during the winter months, transforming the rocky hills and dense forests into a world that is silent and frozen during this time of year. Dylan Parker, who was 18 years old at the time, was negotiating the final stretch of his teenage years in this particular context. The majority of the time, Dylan was a typical child. He was in the process of determining what he wanted to do with his life after graduating from high school. He had a strong bond with his family, particularly with his mother, and he had a nice group of friends from his younger years. He, like many other adolescents, had pleasure in interacting with others, and on the evening of the 12th of January 2016, he found himself at a party with a few of his close companions for the first time. A home in his hometown was the location of the party that was being held. A continuous snowfall had been dusting the town for hours, adding to the already thick snowpack that was on the ground. It was a cold night during which the snowstorm had been occurring. At the interior, there was a friendly and energetic environment. Dylan was having a nice time, and there was music playing, people were talking and laughing, and things were going well. A couple drinks were consumed by him as the night progressed. As the hours went by, Dylan made the decision that it was almost time for him to leave the party and go home. This was not something that was out of the norm for a party like this. The effects of the alcohol were beginning to take hold of him, and the prospect of returning to the warmth and comfort of his own bed felt like a very good idea. It was the weather that was the issue. Considering that it was still snowing and that it was chilly, walking home was not a very good alternative. Therefore, he did what any other child in his position might have done. After pulling out his phone, he dialed his mother's number. As soon as his mother answered the phone, she was able to determine, without a doubt, that Dylan had been drinking. There was a slight slur in his voice, and his words were slurred. She felt the usual mixture of parental emotions, a little amount of disappointment, a touch of aggravation that he was drinking at a young age, but the thing that made her feel the most concerned was a profound sense of protectiveness over him. It was late, the weather was terrible, and all she truly needed was to know that her son was safe and sound while he was staying at home. It would be possible for them to discuss his decisions in the morning. Consequently, she listened attentively when he inquired about the possibility of her coming to pick him up. It was he who informed her that he was at a party and that he would stroll down the road to a gas station in the vicinity in order to meet her. It was a well-known location that was simple to locate. There was no uncertainty in her agreement. She informed him that she was on her way and that he should wait for her at the location she was going to be. Immediately following the conclusion of the call, Dylan's mother retrieved her keys and her coat before departing into the chilly night. As the snow continued to fall, the roads became difficult to navigate and visibility was somewhat diminished. While she was driving, she kept her mind focused on her son. Although she was imagining the lecture that she was going to deliver to him the next day, the primary objective at the moment was to just get him into the car and drive him back to the house. It was possible that she was only a few minutes away from the petrol station when her phone called once again as she was driving. Dylan was the one. On the other hand, the manner in which he spoke was entirely different this time. A comfortable and intoxicated slur was no longer present. She felt a bolt of alarm run through her body as a result of the sharp, anxious edge that had replaced it. Fear was audible in his voice. When he inquired, "Where are you?" "Where are you, Mom?" His voice was strained and frantic. "Where are you?" She attempted to reassure him that everything would be fine by assuring him that she was almost there, that she would be there in a minute or two, and that she was almost there. They were only a short distance away. However, the call was cut off suddenly. He just ended the call. It was 1 minute later when she pulled into the petrol station, which was illuminated by strong fluorescent lights. As she examined the surroundings, she anticipated seeing Dylan waiting for her, possibly stamping his feet to increase his body temperature. The snow was swirling around her car as she did so. However, he was not present. During the few minutes that she waited in the car, she entertained the thought that perhaps he was just walking down the road and was running a little bit behind schedule. However, the minutes continued to pass, and there was still no indication that he was present. She started to feel a knot of worry tightening up in her stomach. She attempted to call his phone, but the call was immediately transferred to his voicemail. That was a peculiar occurrence. Not long ago, he had called her. Why is his phone turned off at this moment? After getting out of her vehicle, she proceeded to stroll into the gas station. She inquired with the person working behind the counter as to whether or not they seen a young man who matched the description of her son. There was a head shake from the cashier. There had been no one else in the room like that. At this point, genuine fear was beginning to take hold. She got back into her vehicle and started driving around the neighborhood in the immediate vicinity. As she drove between the gas station and the house where the party had been held, she went up and down the road 3 times. She cried his name into the snowy night as she rolled down the window, allowing the chilly air to rush in. The night was silent around her. However, the only reaction that could be heard was the gentle hiss of the snow falling. Dylan! Dylan! Approximately 30 minutes passed while she was driving around, and her heart was beating rapidly with each passing moment. She continued to call his phone over and over again, but each and every time the call was disconnected and sent to his voicemail. The situation was not right. This was not typical of him. That frantic phone call kept playing over and over in her head. Something had transpired in his life during the brief interval of time that elapsed between the initial call he made to her and the subsequent call he made to her. She was absolutely confident that she required assistance, and the realization gave her a chill down to her bones. She halted her vehicle, her hands shaking, and then she dialed the number for the police. The data were taken down by the police from Dylan's mother, who was in a state of panic when they arrived. The young man, who was 18 years old, went to a party, had a few drinks, and then called for a ride, and now he is missing. In a circumstance such as this one, the first notion that comes to mind is frequently that the individual is not in any real danger. Perhaps he became disoriented as a result of the booze and made the decision to stroll to the residence of a different acquaintance. Perhaps his phone had a malfunction and he had to find a place to rest for the night nonetheless. However, there was not an immediate feeling of a significant crisis, despite the fact that the police had informed his mother that they would seek for him. Once they arrived, their first destination was the residence where the party had been held. They entered the building and immediately began conversing with the children who were still present. Specifically, they inquired about Dylan. What was the most recent time that they visited him? What kind of temper did he have? Is he going to tell you where he is going? Every single one of the responses was similar. Everyone remarked that Dylan appeared to be in good health. His disposition was upbeat, and he was simply hanging out with the other people. Towards the end of the night, he merely stated that his mother was on her way to pick him up at the gas station. After that, he said his goodbyes and went out of the door. Nobody seen him getting into a car with anyone else. Nobody overheard any arguments, and nobody witnessed anything out of the ordinary. Just now, he left. According to their point of view, the evening came to a conclusion that was entirely typical. After expressing their gratitude, the law enforcement officers returned to the outdoors. The search of the area was initiated by them. The route that led from the party home to the gas station was investigated by them. Their flashlights were able to cut through the pouring snow as they searched in ditches and behind buildings. And still, they discovered nothing. There is no trace of Dylan. They did not find any discarded jackets or footprints that they could positively identify as belonging to him. While the hours went into days, the search for Dylan Parker became more and more intensified. As time went by, the initial hypothesis that he had simply wandered out and would return with a slight hangover began to lose its validity, and it was gradually replaced with a rising concern for his well-being. A bigger number of search parties were formed by the local police enforcement. Many others, including friends, relatives, and members of the community, came out to lend a hand, dressed in heavy clothing, to protect themselves from the bitter cold of the Idaho winter. Across the entirety of Osborne, they dispersed themselves and searched in fields, neighborhoods, and wooded regions. They concentrated on the path that he ought to have followed, which was from the party house to the gas station, and then expanded their search grid in a more general direction from there. However, the snow proved a significant hindrance. Because of the severe snowstorm that occurred on the night that he vanished, any possible trails or evidence had been covered up, and the environment remained frozen solid due to the cold temperatures. It was like trying to find a needle in a huge haystack that was completely white. The family of Dylan found themselves in a state of suspended pain for a period of 10 agonizing days. They jumped with excitement at every phone call, hoping that there was some kind of news. Every time someone knocked on the door, a new wave of anxiousness was triggered. The flyers for the missing person were distributed across the entire town, with the image of Dylan's happy smile appearing on community notice boards and telephone poles. The town of Osborne came together in support of them, but in spite of all the efforts that were made, there was unquestionably nothing. At that moment, it appeared as though Dylan Parker had simply disappeared into the chilly winter air. The police had no leads to follow. Even though they had investigated his phone records, the most recent action that had occurred was that frantic call to his mother. Immediately after that, the phone was either turned off or the battery died in some way. The digital trace could not be followed in any way. After 10 days had passed since Dylan had vanished, the investigation suddenly took a tragic and unexpected turn. Police officers or search teams were not the ones who made the find. It was a complete and utter coincidence. It was a desolate region outside of town where two people were out riding their all-terrain vehicles, ATVs. As they navigated the treacherous and icy terrain, they were having a good time when they experienced a collision. Although it was not a serious incident, they made the decision to leave their damaged ATVs there and come back for them in the morning. This was because it was late in the evening. They went back to the location the following day when the sun was shining brightly in order to return and reclaim their automobiles. And at that moment, they came across something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a body that was lying in a dense stretch of forest high up on a hill, partially covered in snow. As soon as they could, they contacted the authorities. It was determined that Dylan Parker was the deceased individual when the police arrived and recognized the body. The worst concerns that his family had had just come true. As the initial wave of shock and grief went over everyone, however, the detectives who were present at the site started to discover that something was extremely, extremely wrong. The very location was the first significant warning sign that was raised. It was a long way from where anyone had been looking when Dylan was discovered. In order for him to arrive to this location, he would have needed to walk in the opposite direction of the petrol station where he was meant to meet his mother. The petrol station was located in the middle of the town, close to the roadways, the lights, and the heart of the community. Away from all of that was the location where he was discovered. It would have been necessary for him to walk uphill, away from the town, and into the woods where it would have been dark. In no way did it make any sense at all. The presence of alcohol in Dylan's system would eventually be confirmed by a toxicology study, despite the fact that he was actually in his hometown. He was so familiar with the region that he could walk into it. In spite of the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol, it seems highly improbable that he would become so bewildered that he would walk for kilometers in the wrong way, uphill and into a tough environment that was covered in trees. By heading in the direction of the gas station, one was walking in the direction of civilization. There would have been a clear beacon in the form of the lights of the town. If you walked in the opposite direction, you would be entering a completely dark wilderness. There was a major disparity between the two routes. Why would he choose the path that would take him away from his ride home and away from the potential for danger? On the other hand, that was only the beginning of the peculiar and unsettling riddle that the detectives were currently looking into. In and of itself, the scene exhibited a number of physical inconsistencies that prevented any straightforward explanation from being possible. The snow was the component that was the most perplexing. The night that Dylan went missing, there was already a considerable amount of snow on the ground, and it continued to snow throughout the night. Dylan was in the process of going missing. There was no snowfall for the 10 days that followed, which was the time period until his body was discovered. The temperatures remained constantly below freezing, which meant that none of the snow that was already present had melted. This was an extremely important fact. A flawless and unaltered record of the ground was produced as a result of this. A clear set of tracks would have been left behind by any person or vehicle that moved through that region, and those tracks would have been preserved in the frozen snow. An exhaustive search of the entire area surrounding Dylan's body was carried out by the detectives after his body was reported missing. Footprints, tire marks, and any other indication of how he arrived were among the things that they were looking for. It was a complete failure. There were no traces that led to the body of the deceased. It was impossible to find any tracks that led away from the body. It was impossible to find any form of footsteps, not only his, but also those of anyone else. Neither an automobile nor an all-terrain vehicle left any tire tracks here. The snow that was all around him was unbroken and as smooth as silk. It appeared as though he had been meticulously positioned there from above, as if he had tumbled down from the heavens into that particular location. This revelation was the single most important factor in disproving the idea that he had strayed off and became disoriented. In the event that he had walked there, there would have been a lengthy and distinct path of his own footsteps flowing up the hill and into the woodland underneath. Neither of these trails existed. Without a doubt, it was physically impossible. Given this information, it was likely that he had been brought to that area by means of another method. If so, how? In this case, a vehicle would have left tracks. There would have been a clear path left behind, even by a snowmobile. In contrast, there was nothing. Simply by virtue of this circumstance, the investigation was transformed from a possible accident into a death that was subject to intense suspicion. As the detectives continued their search, the more peculiar these circumstances appeared. Dylan was discovered without his pants and without his boots, which was yet another piece of information that was really unsettling about the scene. However, his lower body was exposed to the elements, despite the fact that he was wearing a shirt and socks. The fact that hypothermia was stated as the official cause of death for the individual in question was a peculiar occurrence overall. Despite the fact that it is true that a person might experience a phenomena known as paradoxical undressing in the final stages of freezing to death, in which they begin to feel hot and begin to remove their garments, the fact that those clothes were completely absent from the scene was extremely suspicious. His pants and boots ought to have been laying right there next to him, or at least someplace in the immediate neighborhood, if he had removed them on his own while he was in a state of confusion. There was a thorough and extensive search of the region that was carried out. A grid was constructed by dozens of law enforcement authorities and search and rescue teams on the hillside and in the woodland surrounding the location where Dylan was discovered. They searched every inch of the area. A combination of metal detectors and K9 units that had been specifically trained to locate pieces of clothing and human scent were utilized by the team. They looked on for several days. His pants were never located by them. His boots were never located by them. all of the goods had simply vanished. The fact that he did not remove them himself at that location was strongly implied by this revelation. It suggested that they were removed and taken away from the scene by a different individual, maybe with the intention of removing any potential evidence that might have been present. The condition of Dylan's feet, on the other hand, was perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence that pointed away from the accident theory. Upon his discovery, he was only wearing socks. It would be necessary for a person to go through a difficult, snowy, and rocky forest in order to reach that remote location that is located high on a hill. If someone were to attempt that voyage without wearing boots, they would undoubtedly get multiple injuries. They would suffer cuts, scrapes, and bruises on their feet as a result of the pebbles and branches that were concealed behind the snow. This would result in their socks being ripped to shreds and covered in mud, snow, and grime. This is nothing more than basic physics and common sense. When the body of Dylan was investigated by the detectives, they were astounded to discover that his socks were spotless. There was no evidence of them being damp, unclean, or ripped. And when the feet were examined by the coroner, it was discovered that they were absolutely free of any injuries. Everything that would have indicated that he had traveled even a short distance over that kind of terrain was completely absent, including cuts, bruises, scratches, and other marks. As a result of this particular piece of information, the official story was entirely discredited. The task was not feasible. There is no way that he could have done that by foot. The absence of footprints in the snow that was completely untouched, the fact that his pants and boots were absent, and the fact that his feet and socks were clean and unharmed, all contributed to the creation of a disturbing picture. There was no evidence that Dylan Parker made his way into the woods and died of hypothermia. That is where he was brought. The circumstance had been fabricated. This somebody had either transported him or drove him to that spot via an unidentified method that did not leave any traces behind, removed some of his clothing, and then left his body there for others to discover there. The event in question was not a terrible accident, rather it was something much more diabolical. Behind the scenes, a huge disagreement started to develop as the official investigation moved forward toward its conclusion. The official cause of death was ruled to be hypothermia according to its finding. On the basis of this information, the local authorities and the county were getting ready to conclude the case and declare Dylan's death to be the result of an undesirable accident. The story that they were constructing was that he had been drinking, that he had become disoriented in the snowstorm, that he had strayed in the wrong direction, and that he had ultimately passed away due to the frigid conditions. Although they accepted the peculiar features, they appeared determined to disregard them as anomalies that might be explained, possibly due to the fact that he was under the influence of alcohol. Nevertheless, this straightforward explanation was not accepted by all individuals. An individual by the name of David Roos, who served as the deputy coroner, was one of the important figures who disagreed. Roos had been present at the location. After examining Dylan's body, he had left. In addition, he was the kind of person who put the utmost faith in reasoning and evidence. It was very clear to him that this was not anything that could have happened by chance. Among the anomalies that were not insignificant were the pristine snow that did not have any tracks, the missing clothing that were never located, and most importantly, the spotless socks and feet that were not wounded. They were evident inconsistencies with the theory that the disaster occurred. He was certain that Dylan had been the victim of some kind of criminal activity. He was under the impression that Dylan had been attacked or killed after leaving that party, and that his body had been transported sometime later to that hillside in order to deceive authorities. He suspected that something had occurred to Dylan after he left that party. His professional view was that the scene was a planned performance. David Roos became somewhat outspoken in his expression of his worries. His findings were reported to his superiors, and he urged that the case ought to be treated as a possible homicide. He also had conversations with the investigators who were leading the investigation. He was of the opinion that it would be a grave injustice to Dylan and his family to just assume that it was an accident, that whoever was genuinely responsible for his death would be able to get away with it was the implication of this. However, his arguments were not taken seriously by anyone. Those in charge of the local government were resolute in their conclusion. In a public announcement, they stated that Dylan Parker's death was the result of an accident and that there was no evidence to suggest that he was murdered. They were formally putting an end to the investigation. David Roos was utterly appalled by this decision. His impression was that the authorities were disregarding physical evidence that could not be refuted. Instead of letting it go, he made the decision to voice his concerns to the general public. In his statement to the media, he detailed the various contradictions that were present at the site and expressed his unwavering conviction that Dylan had been the victim of an assault. He anticipated that by drawing the attention of the public to the issue, he would be able to exert pressure on the county to restart the inquiry and take a serious look at the potential of homicide. In his defense of what he considered to be the truth, he was fighting. However, the response that he received from the county was not what he had hoped for. In lieu of conducting a fresh investigation into the matter, they focused their attention on him. David Roos was terminated from his post as deputy coroner by the county shortly after he made his disagreement with the current administration public. In their formal explanation, they stated that he was no longer qualified to perform the duties of the position. Roos, on the other hand, was persuaded that he was terminated for one purpose and one reason only, to keep him hidden from the public. He was under the impression that the county was trying to cover up the case in order to avoid the hassles and potential scandal that would arise from a homicide inquiry. He was a thorn in their side. Not only did they remove his official platform by sacking him, but they also made it abundantly apparent that they would not allow any type of opposition. Therefore, the official version of events was correct. It was determined that Dylan Parker's passing was by accident. This case has been resolved. However, there was never any more investigation carried out. Never once was anyone questioned about the likelihood of a criminal act being committed. It was never attempted to identify the person or individuals who were most likely responsible for Dylan's passing. Dylan's family was placed in an unfavorable circumstance as a result of the consequences of this decision. The pain that they were left with was compounded by a terrible sense of injustice, and they were completely unable to find any answers to their questions. They were given an official explanation for their son's death that was completely illogical and contradicted all of the evidence. They had a familiarity with both their son and the community. It was unfathomable to think that he would become so disoriented that he would walk in the opposite direction of his ride home, uphill into a dark forest, and that he would accomplish this without leaving a single footprint. Although it was terrifying to think about, the idea that was proposed by the coroner, David Roos, was the only one that appeared to be consistent with the peculiar and unsettling facts. The absence of traces, the absence of garments, and the pristine condition of his feet could all be accounted for by this one explanation alone. The question is, what exactly took place with Dylan Parker on that chilly night in January? We are able to attempt to rebuild a series of events that is more credible despite the fact that it is scary based on the data. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, Dylan left the party with the intention of walking the short distance to the petrol station. During the course of that little stroll, he came across something or someone. It was possible that it was a person he knew, but it could also have been a complete stranger. A ride might have been provided to him by them. When he called his mother for the first time, he was calm. Simply put, he was validating the action plan. However, within the few minutes that followed, a terrible occurrence occurred regarding the situation. The second phone call, the one in which he sounded terrified and worried, was most likely made while this horrific new circumstance was taking place. It's possible that he became aware that he was riding in a vehicle with a person who had no intention of driving him to the gas station. It's possible that a disagreement broke out. The last time anyone ever heard from him was when he committed suicide. What happened next is unknown, but it seems likely he was taken to a different, secondary location. He was either slain on purpose or restrained and left to expire as a result of exposure to the weather. Both of these events took place at that location. The people responsible then held onto his body for some period of time. After several days, perhaps when they felt the initial search efforts were dying down or moving to other areas, they decided to dispose of his body. They chose a remote location, a place where he was unlikely to be found quickly, but a place that might eventually be discovered. They transported his body up that hillside, possibly carrying him to avoid leaving footprints. They placed him carefully in the snow, removing his pants and boots before they left. Why they took those items is a mystery. Perhaps it was to remove any potential DNA evidence that might have been on them. Or maybe, in a more disturbing twist, they were taken as a kind of trophy. This reconstruction is the only one that accounts for all the impossible evidence found at the scene. It explains why there were no tracks in the snow. It explains why his feet and socks were clean. It explains why his pants and boots were missing and never found. But because the case was officially closed as an accident, this is all just theory. The troubling questions remain unanswered. Who did Dylan encounter after he left the party? What was said or done that led to that terrified phone call? And who would go to such elaborate lengths to stage a death scene to look like an accident, only to do it so poorly that it was full of impossible contradictions? For the family of Dylan Parker, these questions are a constant, haunting presence. They are left with the memory of their son and the knowledge that the truth of what happened to him was dismissed and buried along with him, leaving a cold case in the snows of Idaho that may never be solved. You are very much appreciated for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. 2011. This is the year in question. Heike Dorse and Stefan Ramin, a young couple from Germany, discovered that life was full of wonderful events. They met each other and began their journey together. What they have accomplished over the course of the previous 3 years is something that the bulk of us can only conceive about currently. The mundane existence that they had been leading, including their jobs, their apartments, and everything else, had been completely disregarded by them during their entire lives. As soon as they had gathered all of their necessities, they made their way on board Stefan's catamaran, which was an incredible vessel that would eventually become their place of residence. In spite of the fact that it appeared to be straightforward, their method was extremely ambitious. They were going to sail across the world according to the plan. They carried out this activity for a period of 3 years in a certain fashion. They experienced storms that tested their bravery and saw beaches that looked like paintings. They enjoyed a life of perfect freedom on the vast water where they did not have to worry about anything. They also endured storms that tested their bravery and tested their resolve. It was a dream that they both shared and that they were experiencing every single day. It was a retreat of the highest order they could possibly imagine. As a result, on the 30th of August in 2011, they made the discovery that they were sailing in a route that was southwesterly from the Galapagos Islands and that they had arrived in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. During this particular instance, they had been at sea for an extended period of time without any interruptions. For 17 consecutive days, there was not a single view of land. There was not even a single peak. Over the course of time, the globe had morphed into a vast expanse of blue sky and blue sea that never seemed to end. On the deck of the catamaran, Heike was simply basking in the warmth of the sun and taking pleasure in the sensation of the waves softly rocking against the coast. She was loving the experience. Very little noise could be heard. This was the typical behavior for them. The silence that had been present was abruptly broken by the voice of Stefan. He merely cried out one word, and that was, "Land to the world." In order to shield her eyes from the bright light, Heike sat up and started staring in the direction of the horizon, which was the direction that Stefan was pointing. It looked to be nothing more than a thin, dark line at first. However, as they got closer, the shapes became more apparent. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a thin line. Out in the distance, she was able to make out the contours of mountainous islands that were rocky and green, and they rose up out of the ocean. After spending so many days surrounded by nothing but water, it was a sight that will leave you gasping for air with its breathtaking beauty. An examination was conducted on the Marquesas Islands, which are a group of islands that are located in French Polynesia and are considered to be a remote archipelago. As Heike watched the islands continue to expand in size, she couldn't help but feel a smile spreading across her face. Following the passage of some time, she recalled that she was unable to stop smiling for no apparent reason. The location seemed to be a paradise in the real world, a world that had been lost to the passage of time, and she was brimming with delight at the idea of finally stepping onto solid ground once more than she had been in a very long time. The Marquesas Islands are a chain of around 15 volcanic islands that are not your typical vacation site. This is in contrast to other tourist attractions, particularly those that are more typical. On the other hand, in contrast to the postcards that show French Polynesia, these islands do not have the spacious beaches with white sand and the quiet lagoons that are a bright blue color. The way in which these islands existed was one of a kind. They were rocky, dramatic, and had a hue that was incredibly green. Additionally, they had mountain peaks that were jagged and appeared to cut through the clouds. The color of the water was not the tranquil turquoise that people normally anticipate seeing in the water around them. Rather, it was a deep, dark blue. In spite of this, the circumstances could not have been more favorable for both Heike and Stefan. They were not interested in finding resorts or tourist traps on their list of prospective discoveries. Over the course of their journey, they had set sail across the globe in quest of genuine experiences with the objective of building genuine ties with ethnic groups from all over the world. In addition, it was discovered that the Marquesas Islands were the perfect place to carry out the activity in issue. The presence of a significant number of people hailing from other nations was something that they were not comfortable with. Because tourists were so uncommon in the region, Heike and Stefan were welcomed with open arms and genuine curiosity when they arrived. This was due to the uncommon occurrence of travelers in the area. They were quickly accepted by the community, and they were welcomed with open arms. This took very little time. They were fortunate enough to earn invites to cookouts on the beach, where they entertained local families with their tales and shared meals with them. People who resided on the island taught Stefan how to spearfish in the traditional fashion, and he took to the activity with an enthusiasm that was infectious. Stefan's enthusiasm was contagious. On a certain occasion, they were extended an invitation to participate in a lavish dinner by a family that lived in the area. They had been treated as if they were their own children, and they were surrounded by the happiness of children and the sensitivity of a family that had shown them affection. During their time together, Heike and Stefan were seated on the floor and enjoying a delectable dish that they had never tried before. Exactly what they had been hoping for all along was to have that happen. They went through the Marquesas for a total of 6 wonderful weeks, during which time they visited a series of breathtaking islands before making their way back to the mainland. They were knowledgeable about the culture of the region, they made new friends, and they felt as though they had found a place that they could call their second home. On the other hand, as their time in French Polynesia was drawing to a close, they became conscious of the fact that there was still one island in the chain of 15 that they had not yet visited. The island in question was simply referred to by its name, Nuku Hiva. They were unable to leave without having the chance to experience it because it was regarded for being the largest and most dramatic of all the Marquesas, and they were unable to go without having those opportunities. The day before they were scheduled to leave the islands for good, they made the decision to make one last stop before beginning their journey. This decision was reached on the day before they were planned to leave. They had just started sail on their catamaran in the direction of Nuku Hiva when they came to a tranquil location where they could drop anchor. As they looked in the direction of the shore, they became aware of a peculiar silence that seemed to envelop the entire area. There were no other boats to be located in the bay at any time and place. Unfortunately, there was not a single fisherman who could be found casting their nets. On the beach, there were no people playing in the sand, and there were also no children running around and having fun. It was completely devoid of everything. The place was completely devoid of any people, and the atmosphere was almost spooky. This specific island was devoid of any silence, which was a striking contrast to the lively and friendly atmosphere that prevailed on the other islands that they had visited. I had the impression that they had arrived in a region that had been abandoned for quite some time. Their inherent inquisitiveness ultimately triumphed. They hauled their tiny dinghy to the coast and brought it up onto the beach where they were standing. They were standing on the beach. After passing over the sand dunes, they came upon a short route that would eventually take them into the dense, verdant forest. By virtue of the fact that they were explorers, they were incapable of putting up any resistance. There was a need for them to discover where it led them. While they continued to go down the road, the sounds of the jungle were getting closer and closer to them. They were getting closer and closer to the jungle. The air was thick and humid, and it was filled with the buzzing of insects and the calls of birds that could not be seen. The air was filled with the sounds of birds. After continuing to travel down the narrow track for almost 15 minutes, the path gradually opened up into a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing, there was a people's hamlet that gave off the impression of being slightly unusual. In order to put together a small collection of abandoned shacks that were arranged in a collection, wood and corrugated metal were utilized all throughout the process. On the other hand, I had a difficult time discerning whether or not there was actually anyone living there. There was a feeling of desolation in the air, as if the people who lived there had only left a few years ago due to the fact that they had abandoned their homes. Nothing that could be considered proof of life could be found. There was no smoke emanating from any of the shacks, there were no noises, and there was nada. The two individuals, Heike and Stefan, stood there for a brief amount of time, taking in their surroundings and feeling as though they were intruding on a site that had been forgotten. And then they turned their attention to him. Further along the path, beyond the collection of shacks that were dispersed along the path, there was a man who was standing in the middle of the road. The fact that he was a very large and well-built guy was not reflected in the fact that he was not wearing a shirt. Although he was standing quite still next to a horse, he was merely looking at them in a straightforward manner. He was retaining his position very still. There was no indication that he was calling out to them or waving at them. No smile can be seen on his face. While he was merely observing them, the look on his face was absolutely blank and made it impossible to decipher it. When I saw him standing there, he was so completely silent and focused on what he was doing that it was a little unnerving. As a consequence of that, a shiver ran down each and every one of their spines. However, after a brief pause, they came to the realization that the most polite thing to do would be to approach the individual and introduce themselves to them. They were the ones who had entered his area, and it was highly possible that one of his communities was located here. At the end of the day, they were the ones who made the transition. Next, they made their way over to the individual in question. After they had gone through the process of introducing themselves to one another, he disclosed to them the name of Arihano. He confirmed that he did, in fact, live in the village. He was the one who conducted the verification. By working together, they were able to carry on a conversation that was a combination of their weak French and his. Overall, it turned out to be pleasant enough, despite the fact that it was a little weird. They exchanged a few pleasantries with one another, during which time they talked about their backgrounds and the activities that they were taking part in while they were on the island. At one point in time, throughout the course of the conversation, Stefan posed a question to Arihano that was completely unanticipated and served as a reaction to the circumstances that were taking place. A goat hunt was something that he was interested in, so he inquired about the potential of Arihano being willing to be his guide. Over the course of several weeks, Stefan had been discussing this topic, which was something that a significant number of the indigenous males on the Marquesas Islands engaged in. A significant number of the men in the community participated in the customary activity of going on a goat hunt. He was completely enthralled by the idea, and he longed to have the opportunity to experience it himself before they left with their own destination. Arihano gave a thunderous affirmative response in a single millisecond, indicating unanimous agreement. His role was intended to be that of a guide. There was a degree of astonishment that Heike experienced as a result of the sudden thought that Stefan had conceived. The fact that he desired to go on a hunt was something that she was aware of. Nevertheless, she did not anticipate that it would occur in such an unexpected manner with a complete stranger whom they had just met. They were informed that she would not be able to accomplish the work since she did not feel like trekking through the dense jungle in order to chase after goats. She explained that she did not feel like doing so. Her remarks were, "You two go, and I'll head back and wait for you at the boat." After that, she departed. As a consequence of this, Heike performed a U-turn and started walking back down the forest route in the same direction that they had emerged from earlier. She gave her back a single, conclusive look as she walked away from the scene. It was at that moment that she became aware of Stefan and Arihano walking together, the two of them traveling along a different path that headed further into the jungle. She maintained a close eye on them until the thick growth surrounding them covered them, at which point they disappeared from view. After making her way back to the breathtaking beach, which was devoid of any people, Heike eventually arrived. The anticipation that Stefan would come back in a few hours prompted her to make herself comfortable in preparation for a peaceful afternoon together. A towel was spread out in front of her, and she sat back, relaxed, and took delight in the peace and quiet while listening to the sound of the waves crashing on the coast. The amount of time that had passed continued to drag on. When the hour had passed, it was already 2, and then it was 3. The sun started to move lower in the sky, which led to the production of long shadows on the beach, which were caused by the sun's descent. As time went on, she started to feel a very little knot of worry growing in her gut. She was concerned about something. As far as she was aware, she had not heard anything. In addition, neither Stefan nor Arihano could be discovered anywhere in the bush, which was completely silent. She started to have some anxiety, and she started walking up and down the beach while concurrently looking over the edge of the bush. She was beginning to feel a bit uneasy. The moment she became aware of a noise, she was on the verge of experiencing actual panic, which was the culmination of her anxiety. There was a voice that could be heard coming from the direction opposite the lake. Upon raising her gaze, she became aware of a small boat that was approaching the bay from the direction of the rocky point. This was Arihano's fault in the first place. Despite the fact that he was the only person in his boat, he was frantically flailing his arms and yelling for her in French. He was the only person in his boat. Despite the fact that she was unable to correctly pronounce all of the words, she was still able to understand what was being spoken. He was yelling out the information that there had been an accident. When he made the statement, she was required to accompany Stefan as quickly as possible because he had incurred an injury and she was required to travel with him. Immediately, without giving it a second thought, Heike's heart dropped and she forgot about all of the earlier anxiety that she had been experiencing. Panic took grip of the situation. Without even giving a second thought to the possibility that she may be wet, she sprinted into the water immediately. She was able to slip herself other Hanno's small dinghy, and he started the engine of the boat without any delay. They hurriedly made their way back around the curve in the bay, heading in the direction of wherever it appeared that he and Stefan had been. After a period of time, the boat landed at a beach that was so little that it was hidden from view in the distance. It was a tiny stretch of sand that was pressed up against a wall of dense woodland. That was the situation. As soon as the boat made touch with the land, Heike emerged from the water and jumped out. Her mind were racing as she ran headfirst into the jungle, and she did so with enthusiasm. The sound of her voice boomed across the forest and the trees as she started calling Stefan's name. The question is, Stefan, where exactly are you, Stefan? In reaction to this, there was no response. The only sounds that could be heard were her own muddled calls and the rustling of the leaves. Everything else was completely silent. She had no idea where to even begin looking for anything. She was absolutely clueless. She continued to turn around to Arihano, who had followed her onto the beach, and she continued to ask him, where is he? What happened to him for a considerable amount of time? She followed him onto the beach. Arihano, on the other hand, was not supplying her with any answers that were completely evident. He was behaving in a manner that was eerily silent and elusive, and all he was doing was whispering things that were beyond anyone's scope of comprehension. Heike persisted in pushing further into the jungle, despite the fact that she was experiencing feelings of both annoyance and fear. She was yelling even louder than she had been before, and her voice was piercing with the desperation that she was feeling. There has been no deviation. The whole absence of sound was excruciatingly loud. It was finally far too much for her to handle. Arihano was confronted by her, and she demanded that he explain what was going on and show her where Stefan was. She abruptly turned around to confront him. She insisted that he reveal the whereabouts of Stefan to her first. However, as she turned to face him, she discovered that the words were stuck in her throat when she attempted to speak. She was able to take in the sight of him standing right in front of her. In addition to that, he was pointing a gun in her way, specifically direct at her face. Instinct took over the issue almost immediately after it manifested itself. Within a fraction of a second, Heike stretched her hand and grabbed the barrel of the rifle, making an effort to pull it away from her. They were able to detect his attempt to pull the trigger, and she heard the click, but the gun did not fire. She was able to perceive his attempt. Having the safety feature activated, it had merely been a matter of a minute technical issue that had prevented her from being hurt. They were engaged in a furious and horrible struggle for the weapon in the heart of the woods, where there was full and utter quiet. Nevertheless, Arihano was noticeably larger and more strong than the other. Rapidly, he was able to exert his authority over her. When he had finished wrestling her to the ground, he immediately began to restrain her before she even had a chance to realize what was going on. She was detained by having her wrists and ankles tied, and then he dragged her to a nearby tree, where he tied her to the tree by pulling a rope over her neck. He left her there until he was finished with her. He then turned around and simply walked away, disappearing back into the bush. He left her completely to her own devices and unable to do anything to help her condition. He did not speak a single word as he went away. When she was left tied to the tree, her heart was pounding so hard that it was pounding in her chest. There, Heike was left behind. She flinched in response to the sounds of the jungle, which led her to react. Within her head, she was very certain that Arihano would return at any moment to finish the mission that she had assigned to him. As a result of the trauma, I was entirely overpowered. After some time had passed, she stated her desire that he had simply shot her back when he had the ability to do so during those specific instances. She shared this desire at a later time. The horrible worry that came with waiting, the misery that came from not knowing what was going to happen, was 1,000 times worse than a swift conclusion could have been. During the time that Arahano was not present, she struggled against the ropes and made numerous courageous attempts to break free of the constraints that she was under. Having said that, they were not exactly loose. In spite of her best efforts, she was unable to loosen the rope that was wrapped around her neck, which was forcing her to choke. They were able to capture her. Arihano miraculously reappeared at just the moment when she was sitting there, struggling in a state of dread. Nevertheless, he did not offer any remarks. When he merely approached her and hit her, he committed a cruel and unintentional act of violence. He did this without intending to do so. After then, he turned around and went once more, and his way of departure was just as odd as his presence. Incomprehensible and unbearable was the psychological suffering that was experienced not more than a few hours from now. It was... After the sun had set, the jungle was covered in a profound and terrifying blackness. This darkness lasted till the morning. Haika was still tethered to the tree, her body throbbing and her head spinning from the terror she was experiencing. She was still bound to the tree. After some time had passed, she became conscious of the light that was coming from a flashlight, which was able to penetrate the darkness. Arihano's return was a necessity at this point. After approaching her once more, he struck her a couple more times before departing. He then walked away. Nevertheless, this time around, a different event transpired than the previous one. Because he struck her with such carelessness, some of the restraints that she was wearing were accidentally released. This was an unintentional consequence of his action. In spite of the fact that there was only a few minor adjustments, it was adequate. Haika immediately began working frantically at the ropes that were now loosening around her wrists and her neck as soon as he stepped out into the woods for the second time. She became increasingly concerned about the situation. She was able to sense that they were beginning to give way in the end. She was not restrained in any way. Despite the fact that she had no idea where Arihano was standing, she was conscious of the fact that she needed to get away. She got to her feet in a manner that was both quiet and deliberately deliberate. As soon as she took her first step, she became aware of a rustle coming from the area beneath the trees. This rustle was coming from the direction of the trees. When a beam of light from a flashlight suddenly went on and directed in her direction, it was around a couple of 100 yards away from her. This was Arihano's fault in the first place. The movement of her was not lost on him. Considering the circumstances, there was no time to do so. The moment you read this, Haika has just started to run. As she continued to crash through the dense jungle, she ran as fast as she could at full speed and as swiftly as she could. She did not care that branches and thorns were tearing at her flesh and cutting at her face. She was unconcerned about the situation. She was making an effort to flee in order to save her life. On that particular evening, she was fortunate enough to have a full moon visible in the sky. As a result of the moonlight that was able to pass through the canopy, she was able to see with the appropriate level of illumination. Even though she was surrounded by trees, she was able to pick out the faint shimmer of water that was visible through the forest. The distance to the beach was not that great. When she wanted to escape, she just made a beeline for the ocean, which was a metaphor of her yearning to escape. She took a moment to look in the opposite direction as she emerged from the woodland and onto the beach. She did this in order to have a better look at what was going on. As the flashlight that Arihano was using progressed deeper and deeper into the bush, she was able to recognize the light beam that was emerging from it. At first glance, it seemed as though he had reversed his course, probably because he was under the impression that she had escaped in a different manner. It had been decided by him that he would not continue the chase for the time being. She looked out at the water of the bay in a frenetic manner as she battled to recover her breath. She was experiencing a lot of difficulty. During the course of the moonlight, she was able to observe her very own catamaran, which was their place of residence the entire time. Swimming and wading were the means by which she made her way out to it, and her entire body was crying in misery and exhaustion as she did so. Immediately after she boarded the ship, she became aware of the tasks that she needed to complete. She made the call by snatching the satellite phone that the couple had, which was a device that they had on hand only in the event that they needed to use it in an emergency situation. It was reported to the authorities that all that had taken place had been reported, and she informed them of the situation. The fact that her husband Stefan had disappeared, in addition to the fact that a man named Arihano had assaulted her and was still present on the island of Nukuhiva, were both factors that contributed to her disappearance. An exhaustive search was started very immediately after the word was released. They started looking for any sign of Stefan and the person who had attacked Heike on the island. They went through the entire island. The search was initially conducted jointly by the local volunteers and the police. The first few days passed without them making any discoveries, and they did not find anything. Arihano and Stefan had both vanished without a trace, and that was the case. There was no sign of Arihano. With every passing hour, the prospect of finding Stefan still alive appeared to be a little bit less and less hopeful. To add insult to injury, after 3 days of looking, they stumbled across a discovery that was both horrifying and horrible. Understanding what they found requires having a fundamental comprehension of the history of the Marquesas Island. This is important in order to comprehend what they found. The islands were used as a place of abode for Marquesan warriors for a considerable amount of time, beginning from the 12th century and continuing to the present day. In the South Pacific, they were known for being among the most vicious and violent warriors in the region, and their reputation extended throughout the entire region. This reputation spread throughout the Southern Pacific. In addition to that, they were well known for something else they were famous for. They adopted a cannibalistic lifestyle. Throughout the course of history, this method was widely used on the island of Nukuhiva, which was also the island where Stefan had disappeared without a trace. No one in the Marquesas had ever engaged in the practice of cannibalism, according to historians and people alike, who were in complete agreement with this statement. The method, which was still in use today, was a remnant from a harsh age that occurred a very long time ago. Around that time, people were under the impression that it had vanished completely, all the way up until the year 2011. As a result of the circumstances, it was discovered that Arihano was a descendant of these ancient warriors. He considered himself to be a Marquesas class warrior, as he thought of himself. In addition, when he made contact with Stefan Ramin, he arrived at the realization that it was time to bring back the tradition that had been practiced for a very long time. A timeline of the tragic events that occurred was pieced together during the course of the investigation. Since Heike had turned around and walked back to the shore, leaving Stefan and Arihano to continue their search, the situation had become exceedingly perilous almost immediately after she had done so. Arihano had assaulted Stephen, who had been injured. Arihano began to make a large campfire after tying him up, and Stefan gazed in absolute and complete terror as he watched. The officials who later located the spot reported that the remnants of the fire were enormous, 3 times larger than any average campfire that they had ever seen. They stated that the fire had been a devastating event. In a subsequent instance, Arihano recalled how he saw Stefan's pulse in his neck pulsating with anxiety while he was creating the pyre. This occurred while Stefan was under the influence of anxiousness. Afterwards, Arihano shot Stefan and then he threw his body onto the building. Stefan was killed. The authorities were eventually successful in catching Arihano after a period of time had passed. He was put on trial for the murder of Stefan Ramin, and he was determined to be responsible for the crime being committed. On the other hand, there was one thing that he would never, under any circumstances, admit to at any point throughout his trial or during his interrogations. There was never a single instance in which he came forth and unambiguously said that he had consumed pieces of Stefan. Forensic scientists were unable to determine, based on the charred remains, the proportion of Stefan's body that had been devoured by the flames, as opposed to the proportion that could have been consumed by his murderer. This was because of the devastating fire that had taken place earlier. On the other side, for the entirety of the investigation, Heike, the police, the prosecutors, and virtually everyone else who was involved in the case entertained a profound and horrifying suspicion. Not only did they have a strong suspicion that Arellano had murdered Stefan, but they also believed that he had cannibalized him in a ritualistic fashion, reviving a horrifying practice that had been extinct for a very long time in the most horrific form that could possibly be imagined. Stefan's ideal of adventure turned out to be a nightmare, and Heike was left to live with the memory of what had happened in that dark jungle on the island of Paradise. Heike was left to live with the memory of what had happened. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on?
When you think of Russia, your thoughts most likely go to the major cities that are located on the western edge of the country, which is the region of the country that is geographically located in Europe. You may visualize the onion domes that are so famous in Moscow or the streets of St. Tom, Petersburg, which are so historically significant. That is correct, by the way. The majority of the population are located there, and the majority of the historical events that we read about took place there. On the other hand, the portion of Russia known as European Russia accounts for only roughly 23% of the overall area of the country. A vast, untamed, and frequently cruel swath of territory that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean makes up the remaining 77% of the land of the United States. A region known as Siberia is located here. An understatement would be to suggest that Siberia is a landmass. The vastness of this globe, which is comprised of lush woods, towering mountain ranges, and icy tundra, is approximately 50 times larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom. Extremism is the word that best defines what is going on here. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is the weather. Over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madsen was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time, he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March, in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the 4 men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The 4 companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all 4 of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other 3 buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the 3 buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the three friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case, despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all 3 of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madsen because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the location was one that was chosen on purpose? Was the intention to make it simple to locate in order to convey some kind of message? or was it simply a spot that was convenient for him to be left? When he is placed on his back with his arms extended, it gives the impression that he was placed there on purpose, rather than being a body that was simply abandoned. Therefore, the most important question is, who would do this and why would they do it? One theory, which is supported by a significant number of individuals, suggests that the Russian government or some local authorities are responsible. In Siberia, it was discovered that Colin, who had a strong commitment to protecting the environment, had taken part in at least one protest that was staged inside a peaceful setting. An unauthorized development in the area of Lake Baikal was the target of the protest. Following the conclusion of this demonstration, it is believed that Colin was issued a formal written warning by the Russian police, instructing him to refrain from attending any such rallies of this nature. What if this is the reason for it? Is it true that he was considered a problematic American activist? What happened to him? Was he singled out, kidnapped for questioning, and then murdered? This is a somewhat unsettling idea. It is possible that this is the reason why the official investigation was so quick to close off any line of inquiry that did not entail a straightforward accident. It's possible that a failed probe was actually a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth. On the other hand, this idea is not without its flaws. With so many other people participating in the demonstration, why would the government single out Colin? And why would they pick to kidnap him on a night when he was with three of his closest friends, individuals who would immediately notice his absence and raise the alarm if they were to find him missing? An operation that is being carried out in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, even if it was only for a little period of time or for a short period of time. The shocking events that transpired over that week are likely to remain with them for the rest of their lives. The anguish that Colin's parents are experiencing is never-ending. Despite their best efforts, they have been unable to achieve justice for their son. The government of Russia does not give any cooperation, does not provide any fresh information, and there is no possibility that the case will ever be reopened. They are left with the horrific knowledge that their kid was murdered, but it is possible that they will never know who was responsible for the crime or why it was committed. When it comes to this investigation, they are forced to consider the same questions over and over again. Who was hiding in the shadows outside of that cabin in the early morning hours when it was completely dark? To what location did they take Colin? And during those 8 days when they were unable to find him, before they killed him and left him deep within that huge and merciless Siberian wilderness, what did they do to him? You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?
Imagine living in a city of over 3.5 million people, where the streets are a constant roaring sea of traffic, dust, and heat. This is Ibadan, one of the largest and most populated cities in Nigeria. In a place this massive, it is incredibly easy to feel lost or ignored. But for a specific group of young men, they found their community on the back of 2 wheels. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are known as Okadas. They are the lifeblood of Ibadan, weaving through gridlock to get people to work, school, and home. Because their job is tough and often dangerous, the Okada riders developed a remarkably tight-knit brotherhood. They would gather at specific spots along the city streets, waiting for fares, sharing food, and talking about their lives. They looked out for one another. If a rider went down, the others would help him. If a rider got into trouble with a difficult customer, a dozen others would show up to back him up. They knew each other's routines, families, and dreams. So, in the early months of 2014, when two of these riders suddenly stopped showing up to their usual spots, the entire Okada community noticed immediately. At first, their friends and families held out hope that maybe they had just taken a long-distance fare or gone to visit relatives in another town. But, as the days turned into weeks, the silence grew deafening. The families went to the local police to report the men missing, but the police did not seem to care very much. They brushed the families off, suggesting that the young men had probably just walked away from their lives to find better jobs in a different city, or that they had simply run off to avoid some debts. The Okada riders knew this was not true. These men loved their jobs and would never just abandon their families and their valuable motorcycles without saying a word. Realizing that the authorities were not going to lift a finger, the Okadas decided to take matters into their own hands. They launched an informal, citywide search. As they went about their daily shifts, dropping off passengers in every corner of Ibadan, they kept their eyes peeled. They rode down narrow side streets, checked dark alleys, and asked shopkeepers if they had seen their missing brothers. But despite their constant vigilance, they found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. Then, on March 22nd of that same year, a third Okada rider vanished. His name was Lanre Sadiku. Lanre was a young, hard-working guy who was incredibly popular among his peers. He was always smiling, quick with a joke, and incredibly reliable. Unlike the first two riders who had disappeared during their off hours, Lanre went missing right in the middle of a busy workday. On that afternoon, Lanre was hanging out at his usual meetup spot on a bustling city street, waiting for his next fare. His fellow riders were right there with him, chatting and enjoying the afternoon sun. Eventually, two men walked up to Lanre and asked for a ride. Lanre agreed. The two passengers climbed onto the back of his motorcycle, and he kicked the engine over and drove away. In Ibadan, Okada trips are typically very short. Drivers usually take passengers just a few miles down the road, drop them off, and head straight back to their designated stations to pick up the next fare. It was an assembly line of quick trips. But as the afternoon faded into evening, Lanre still had not returned. At first, his friends at the meetup spot figured he might have landed a rare, high-paying passenger who wanted to go all the way to the other side of the city. But when 3 hours passed, then 4, a deep sense of unease settled over the group. One of the riders pulled out his phone and dialed Lanre's number. It went straight to voicemail. This was highly unusual. For an Okada rider, a cell phone is their most vital business tool. It is how clients reach them, how they coordinate rides, and how they make their living. They never, under any circumstances, turned their phones off during a shift. Now, everyone at the station was deeply worried. They stood in a circle, debating what to do, when suddenly a phone began to ring. But it was not the phone they had just called. Lanre actually kept 2 cell phones on him. He had his main, public work phone, and then he had a private, secondary phone that only his closest friends and family knew about. And it was this second, private phone that was now calling one of the riders at the station. The rider answered the call instantly and put it on speakerphone so everyone could hear. But instead of a casual greeting from Lanre, the speaker erupted with a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Lanre was screaming hysterically into the receiver. His voice was cracked, frantic, and filled with tears. He was begging for help. He told his friends that he had been kidnapped. He explained that his captors had blindfolded him and thrown him into an underground room. He said he was not alone. There were 8 other people down there with him, individuals he had never seen before in his life, and they were all locked in this pitch-black, suffocating underground cell. Lanre said they could hear the heavy, muffled footsteps of people walking around on the ceiling directly above them, but they could not see anything at all. In the background of the call, the other riders could hear a terrifying chorus of screams and wails. The other 8 captives were screaming as loud as they possibly could, trying to make enough noise so that whoever was walking above them might hear them and let them out, or perhaps hoping the voice on the other end of the line would hear their desperation. Lanre explained that when they were captured, the kidnappers had aggressively searched them and confiscated all of their belongings, including their wallets and their primary cell phones. But in their haste, the kidnappers had completely missed the small secondary phone that Lanre kept tucked away in a hidden pocket. That tiny mistake was their only lifeline. The riders holding the phone were absolutely horrified. They tried to calm Lanre down, shouting into the speaker for him to take a deep breath and tell them where he was so they could come get him. Lanre took a ragged breath and tried to compose himself. He told them he did not know the exact coordinates, but he had managed to pay close attention to the route while he was being transported. He told them they needed to get onto the main highway leading out of Ibadan and head toward the outskirts of the city. He said they needed to look for the dense, dark tree line of the Soka forest. Right at the edge of the woods, where a narrow dirt footpath began, they would see 2 rusted, burned-out cars. Lanre told them that if they found those cars and followed that footpath deep into the Soka forest, they would eventually hear the voices of the captives crying out from beneath the ground. He begged them to hurry, because he did not know how much time he had left before the captors returned and discovered his hidden phone. The riders at the station yelled back that they were coming right now. They told him to stay on the line to keep talking to them so they could use his voice as a guide once they entered the woods. But right as they said those words, the line abruptly went dead. They tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. The phone had either been turned off, run out of battery, or worse, discovered by the kidnappers. There was no time to lose. Approximately 40 Okada riders from Lanre's meetup spot immediately ran to their bikes, kicked them into gear, and roared out onto the city streets. They drove in a massive, tight formation, weaving through traffic and ignoring traffic lights as they sped toward the highway. They pushed their motorcycles to their absolute limits until they left the concrete jungle of Ibadan behind and the dark, imposing trees of the Soka forest appeared on their left. They slowed down, scanning the shoulder of the road, looking for the landmark Lanre had described. Sure enough, after a few miles, they spotted the skeletal, rusted remains of 2 burned-out cars parked right at the edge of the woods. The riders pulled over, parking their bikes on the side of the highway. They looked at the entrance to the footpath. It was incredibly narrow and heavily overgrown with thick vines, tall weeds, and dense brush. It was completely impassable for their motorcycle. They realized they would have to continue on foot. Unarmed and completely unprepared for what might lie ahead, the 40 men stepped past the rusted cars and onto the path. The forest was thick and dark, blocking out much of the late afternoon sun. Because the trail was so narrow, they had to walk in a single file line, moving quietly through the brush. They did not make a sound. They were straining their ears, trying to catch the faint sound of Lanre's voice or the screams of the other captives coming from beneath the dirt. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs under their boots. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Suddenly, the rider at the very front of the line froze. He holds up his hand, signaling for everyone behind him to stop. They all went dead silent, holding their breath, listening. Then, about 50 feet ahead of them, the thick foliage parted. A man they had never seen before leaped out from behind a massive tree. He screamed something at them in a harsh, angry tone. Before anyone could react, the man raised a heavy gun and began firing directly at the line of riders. The loud cracks of gunfire shattered the silence of the forest. The 40 Okada riders, completely defenseless, turned on their heels and sprinted back down the path as fast as their legs could carry them. They burst out of the tree line, threw themselves onto their motorcycles, and peeled out onto the highway, racing back toward the safety of the city. When they finally got back to their meetup spot, they were trembling and out of breath. They gathered in a tight circle to discuss what had just happened. They knew they could not just abandon Lanre and the other captives. If they did nothing, those people would surely die. They briefly considered going to the police, but after the lazy and dismissive response they had received regarding the first two missing riders, they knew the police would take hours, if not days, to organize any kind of response. By then, it would be far too late. They decided they had to handle this themselves, but they needed a much bigger force. The riders began calling every Okada meetup spot in the surrounding areas. They explained the situation, the phone call from Lanre, the gunman in the woods, and the urgent need for backup. The response was overwhelming. Within a very short amount of time, over 100 Okada riders assembled at the edge of the city. This time, they were not defenseless. They had gathered a makeshift arsenal of weapons. Some carried heavy iron bars, others had thick wooden clubs, sharp knives, machetes, and even a few crude firearms. They were no longer a helpless search party, they were an angry, determined mob. They climbed back onto their bikes and roared down the highway, a massive convoy of headlights cutting through the descending twilight. When they arrived back at the Soka forest, they parked their motorcycles in a massive row along the shoulder of the highway. They bypassed the two burned-out cars and marched onto the narrow footpath. But this time, they made absolutely no attempt to be quiet. They marched shoulder to shoulder where they could, waving their weapons in the air and letting out loud, terrifying war cries. They wanted the gunmen and anyone else hiding in those woods to know that a massive, angry horde was coming for them and they were ready for a fight. They marched deep into the forest, fully expecting to be shot at any moment. But the woods remained eerily quiet. The gunmen from before had apparently fled, terrified by the sheer volume of noise and the size of the incoming mob. After walking for what felt like miles through the dense vegetation, the path suddenly opened up. The thick trees gave way to a massive circular clearing in the middle of the forest. Flowing right through the center of this clearing was a small but deep river with fast-moving water. It would have been incredibly difficult to cross on foot, but spanning the water was an old, crumbling stone bridge. On the far side of this bridge, sitting in the gloomy twilight, were two dilapidated buildings. The first building, located closest to the bridge, was a small, weather-worn shack made of dark plywood. It had a single dirty window that looked out toward the path. The second building, situated further back in the clearing, was a massive, warehouse-like structure with high, crumbling concrete walls. Surrounding this large warehouse was a tall, rusted chain-link fence with thick coils of rusty barbed wire wrapped tightly around the top. The entire place looked completely abandoned, like an old, forgotten industrial site rotting away in the middle of the wilderness. The mob of Okada riders slowed their pace as they stepped into the clearing, their eyes scanning the dark structures for any sign of movement. As they approached the crumbling stone bridge, one of the riders glanced down at the muddy banks of the river below. He gasped and pointed. Tucked away under the shadow of the stone arch, partially hidden by tall river reeds, was Lanre's motorcycle. It had been driven down here, pushed off the path, and hidden away. This was the absolute proof they needed. Lanre was here, or at least he had been very recently. The riders surged across the bridge, their anger and adrenaline reaching a boiling point. They ran straight to the small plywood shack. One of the men kicked the door open, ready to face an attacker, but the tiny building was empty. However, what they saw inside the shack made them pause in confusion. The small room was packed from floor to ceiling with hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing, There were piles of shirts, pants, dresses, children's clothes, and hundreds of pairs of shoes. There were also wallets, bags, and personal identification cards scattered everywhere. It looked like a bizarre, silent museum of lost people. Confused and deeply unsettled, the mob backed out of the shack and turned their attention to the massive concrete warehouse behind the barbed wire fence. They stood before the fence, shouting for whoever was inside to show themselves, but only silence echoed back from the concrete walls. One of the riders had brought a pair of heavy bolt cutters to use as a club. He stepped forward, bent down, and began cutting through the thick metal links of the fence. He worked quickly, cutting a massive, jagged hole in the barrier. The riders squeezed through the opening one by one, stepping onto the overgrown ground inside the perimeter. The warehouse was silent. The windows were set very high up on the concrete walls, making it impossible to see inside. But as they walked around the perimeter of the building, a horrific, overpowering stench began to wash over them. It was the unmistakable, sweet, and sickening smell of decay. They continued around to the very back of the structure, where they finally found an entrance. The doorway was blocked by a large, rusted sheet of tin metal that had been propped up against the gap in the concrete wall. One of the riders stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the metal sheet, and dragged it aside with a loud, scraping screech. A few of the armed riders immediately stepped through the threshold, holding their weapons high, ready to fight off any guards or kidnappers who might be waiting in the shadows. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light inside the warehouse, their weapons slowly lowered. The anger faded from their faces, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. In the middle of the dirt floor lay a tilted concrete slab propped up on stones with a blood-stained wooden bowl positioned to catch runoff. Surrounding this slaughtering slab were human bones, some still with decaying flesh clinging to them. Along the walls, chained up like animals, were 23 skeletal, barely alive people who had been kept in a catatonic state. These captives were being systematically harvested for their body parts to fuel a highly lucrative, illegal black market trade in ritual magic materials. Herbalists in Nigeria paid massive sums for fresh human organs and limbs, believing they would grant wealth and power to their clients. The warehouse was essentially a body part factory where victims were kept alive and butchered on demand. In the back rooms, searchers also discovered a crude guillotine and a live chained crocodile, which the captors used to dispose of the dead or those who could no longer survive the harvesting process. According to the locals living nearby, they had seen a black Jeep with tinted windows drive down a rough, hidden path to the warehouse every single night at 8 o'clock for the last 10 years. Each night, the forest would echo with horrific, blood-curdling screams until the Jeep departed around 9:30. The locals had repeatedly complained to the police, but the police brushed them off and told them to ignore it. It turned out the driver of the Jeep was the primary distributor of the harvested parts, delivering them directly to wealthy clients. When the Okada mob stormed the property, the guards and the driver of the Jeep fled through the hidden road, leaving the survivors behind. The riders quickly smashed the heavy chains to free the 23 survivors, but as they searched the faces of the barely conscious victims, they realized Lanre was not among them. They began searching the mass graves outside, but there was still no trace of their missing friend. Lanre had said on the phone that he was locked in an underground cell, but the warehouse had a solid concrete floor. The Okadas desperately searched the property for a hidden entrance, hammering on the ground and begging the catatonic survivors for answers, but they got nothing. When the police finally arrived, the riders begged them to bring heavy digging equipment to excavate the site. Instead, the police cordoned off the area and, within days, brought in bulldozers to completely demolish the warehouse, burying any hidden chambers under a mountain of rubble. Many believed the police did this to cover up their own corruption and complicity. For weeks, the Okadas returned with shovels to dig through the debris, but they never found the underground cell. It is believed that Lanre and the other 8 captives remained trapped beneath the earth, suffocating in the dark. While no one was ever legally prosecuted, the Okadas did deliver a swift form of street justice. A few days after the discovery, they caught a suspicious man wandering the ruins with several fresh human tongues in his pockets and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. Assuming he was part of the harvesting ring, the mob killed him on the spot. Later, a well-educated survivor revealed how she had been kidnapped by men in a fake police van, stripped naked at the clothing shack, and chained inside the warehouse to watch others get butchered. Her story exposed how easily ordinary people were snatched from the safety of their homes to feed the insatiable demand of the black market. The Soka Forest remains a dark scar on the history of Ibadan, a place where hundreds of innocent people vanished into the shadows and where a frantic plea for help came just a few feet too late. The Soka Forest tragedy left the community of Ibadan in a state of absolute shock and mourning. For years, the families of the missing had been ignored, their desperate pleas for help treated as minor inconveniences by the very authorities who were supposed to protect them. The revelation that a human slaughterhouse had been operating right on the outskirts of their city for over a decade, right under the noses of the local police, completely shattered any remaining trust the public had in the system. The Okada riders, who had shown immense bravery by banding together and marching into the dark woods to save one of their own, were left with a hollow victory. They had saved 23 lives, a truly heroic feat, but they were forced to live with the agonizing knowledge that they could not save their friend Lanre. The silence from the ground where the warehouse once stood remains a heavy, suffocating weight. The concrete and soil of Soka Forest still hold secrets that may never be brought to light, and the families of those who disappeared are left to wonder if their loved ones' final moments were spent in the suffocating dark of an underground cell that was paved over by the hands of the law. It is a haunting reminder of the dark forces that can hide in plain sight and the lengths to which some will go for wealth and power. The stories of the survivors who managed to escape the Soka Forest warehouse serve as a stark testament to the resilience of the human spirits in the face of absolute darkness. These individuals, who were stripped of their clothes, their names, and their basic humanity, have had to walk a long and painful road toward healing. Many of them continue to suffer from severe physical ailments and deep psychological trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. But their survival also stands as a permanent indictment of a broken system that failed them for so many years. The forest may have slowly reclaimed the physical ruins of the warehouse, but the memory of what happened there can never be completely erased. It forces us all to look much more closely at the quiet shadows that exist in our own backyards today. Before you go, just remember this. Somewhere beneath that forest, there may still be voices that were never heard and never will be. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know in the comments and check out the rest of our true crime stories. Because sometimes the scariest stories don't have endings. Until next time. Imagine waking up one day to find that the person you love more than anyone else in the world has spent the last several months plotting your absolute destruction. This is the story of Michael DiPolito, a man who thought he had finally escaped his dark and troubled past, only to realize that his brand new wife was actively trying to have him executed in cold blood. Michael grew up in a quite rough and dangerous neighborhood in South Philadelphia. In this environment, violence, illegal drugs, and prostitution were just ordinary parts of everyday life. At a very young age, Michael fell victim to the same struggles that had plagued his parents for years. He became a severe alcoholic, and soon after, he developed an incredibly serious drug addiction. To fund his expensive habits, Michael dropped out of high school and began selling drugs on the street corner. It was not long before he became completely homeless, sleeping in abandoned and freezing buildings at night just to survive. In 1993, while still in South Philadelphia, Michael was arrested for the first time and charged with drug possession and intent to distribute. Rather than showing up to court, Michael decided to run. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and he became a fugitive on the run from the law. Michael managed to evade the police for a total of 4 years by constantly moving around and keeping a very low profile. By 1997, he knew he had to get out of Philadelphia for good, so he fled south and settled in Boca Raton, Florida. But his troubles followed him down south. Shortly after arriving, he was arrested again, this time for offering an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. He pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution and was released with a minor fine. A year later, a former girlfriend named Karen Tan sued him for child support, presenting a DNA test that proved he was the father of her son. Once again, Michael chose to simply not show up to court. Eventually, Karen got tired of fighting the legal battle and dropped the lawsuit entirely. Michael was incredibly relieved because he was completely broke at the time, earning barely enough to survive by doing odd jobs for a local temporary employment agency. He realized he needed to find a way to make some real money, and his search for a lucrative opportunity led him directly into the arms of the criminal underworld. Through his street connections, Michael was introduced to several associates of the Bonanno crime family. The Bonanno family is famously known as one of the 5 major Italian-American mafia families that dominate organized crime across the United States. The mobsters took a real liking to Michael because he was incredibly charismatic, spoke quickly, and could convince almost anyone to trust him. They offered him a job inside one of their boiler room operations. In the world of crime, a boiler room is a high-pressure telemarketing scam where fraudsters call unsuspecting victims and use aggressive sales tactics to steal their money. Typically, the caller will pitch a fake investment scheme, telling the victim that they need to wire their money immediately to get in on a ground floor opportunity. Once the victim sends the money, the fraudsters pocket it and disappear. Michael proved to be an absolute natural at this kind of work, and he quickly became one of the top earners in the operation. He was so good at tricking people that he eventually decided he did not want to share his profits with the mafia anymore. He wanted a bigger piece of the pie. So, Michael abruptly left the mafia's boiler room and set up 2 independent boiler room scams of his own in South Florida. We do not know exactly how the Bonanno family felt about him walking away, but Michael was focused entirely on his own wealth. By 2002, he had successfully stolen over $155,000 from his victim. He spent the money as fast as he stole it, throwing it away on luxury cars, 5-star hotels, and expensive phone sex lines. But his luck ran out in late 2002 when the police raided his operations. Michael was arrested for a 3rd time, and this time there was no running away. He stood trial, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, followed by a massive 28 years of probation. The court also ordered him to pay back every single dollar of the $155,000 he had stolen. Michael only served 7 months of his prison sentence before being released on probation, but those 7 months completely changed him. He absolutely hated being locked in a cell, and he swore to himself that he would do whatever it took to never go back. When he was released in 2003, Michael immediately took steps to turn his life around. He entered a strict sobriety program, started going to the gym every single morning, and studied hard to earn his GED. He wanted to prove to himself and the world that he could be a law-abiding citizen. After passing his exams, he started a legitimate digital marketing business called Mad Money Incorporated. Over the next 5 years, Michael stayed clean, worked hard, and built his business into a highly successful enterprise that earned him nearly $100,000 a year. By 2008, he was physically fit, financially stable, and successfully paying off his restitution. But while his professional life was on the right track, his personal life was about to become incredibly chaotic. Michael had married his longtime girlfriend, Maria Luongo, in 2007. Maria had stayed by his side through his arrest and prison sentence, but in 2008, Michael made a terrible mistake. He met a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dahlia Muhammad at a local Starbucks, and the two began a passionate affair. Michael fell so deeply in love with Dahlia that he confessed the affair to Maria and divorced her. Just 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Michael and Dahlia got married. The newlyweds moved into a beautiful, expensive condominium that Michael bought for them in the coastal town of Boynton Beach, Florida. At first, their life together seemed like an absolute dream. They were deeply in love, and Michael felt like he had finally found his perfect partner. But only a month after their wedding, on the evening of the 12th of March, 2009, their dream turned into a living nightmare. Michael and Dahlia were relaxing in their living room when they heard a loud, demanding knock on the front door. Michael opened the door and was shocked to find his probation officer standing on his doorstep, flanked by several police officers. The probation officer explained that they had received an anonymous phone call from someone claiming that Michael was using his condo to sell large quantities of steroids, ecstasy, and other illegal narcotics. Michael was absolutely horrified. He knew that any drug charge would instantly violate his probation and send him back to prison for the next 28 years. He told the officers that the tip was completely false, and he stepped aside to let them search the entire condo to prove his innocence. The police entered the home and conducted a thorough search, checking every room, closet, and drawer. But they found absolutely nothing illegal. Although the officers left without making an arrest, Michael and Dahlia were left completely shaken. Their home was in disarray, and the terrifying reality of Michael's vulnerability had set in. They decided they could not sleep in the condo that night, so they packed a few bags and checked into a nearby hotel to get some peace of mind. But the nightmare was far from over. The very next morning, as they walked out to the hotel parking lot to get into Michael's car, they were stunned to see the probation officer and several police cars waiting for them once again. The probation officer approached them and said they had received another anonymous phone call. This time, the caller claimed that Michael was keeping his drug supply hidden inside his vehicle. Michael was furious and terrified, but he once again gave them permission to search the car. The police went through the entire vehicle, opening the glove compartment, checking under the seats, and looking in the trunk. Once again, they found absolutely nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael and Dahlia lived in a constant state of paranoia and fear. They could not stop talking about who might be behind the mysterious anonymous phone calls. Michael knew his past was full of people who had reasons to hate him. He wondered if someone from the Bonanno crime family was trying to set him up, or if one of the victims from his old boiler room scams was seeking revenge. The thought that someone was actively trying to ruin his life and send him back to prison was almost too much to bear. Then, on the night of the 29th of March 2009, 17 days after the first raid, Michael and Dahlia went out to a restaurant for dinner. When they walked out to the parking lot after their meal, they were horrified to see police officers surrounding Michael's car once again. Michael and Dahlia rushed over to the officers, pleading with them to understand that they were being targeted by an unknown enemy who was trying to frame him. But this time, when the police officers opened the trunk of the car and began to search, their expressions changed. Deep inside the trunk, tucked away underneath the spare tire, they pulled out a cigarette carton. Inside the carton was a small plastic bag filled with white powder. It was cocaine. The moment Michael saw the officer pull the bag of cocaine out of his trunk, he collapsed onto the pavement and began to sob uncontrollably. He knew that finding drugs in his possession meant his life was over. His probation would be revoked immediately, and he would be sent to state prison for the rest of his adult life. He wept and begged the officers to believe him, swearing on his life that he had never seen that cocaine before and that he was being set up. Dahlia stood beside him, watching her husband cry hysterically. For a brief second, she wondered if Michael had been lying to her all along and was actually back to his old ways. But seeing his absolute terror and despair, she chose to believe him. She joined in, crying and pleading with the officers to look at the pattern of events. She argued that it made no sense for someone to call the police multiple times if they actually had drugs in their possession. Amazingly, the police officers agreed that the situation was highly suspicious. They decided not to arrest Michael that night. Instead, they confiscated the cocaine and told the couple to go home safely. They promised to launch a full investigation to find the anonymous caller. Michael and Dahlia returned to their condo, locking every door and window behind them. They were incredibly grateful that Michael had not been arrested, but they were also living in absolute terror. Whoever was trying to frame Michael was no longer just calling in fake tips, they were actively breaking into their property and planting real drugs. They spent the next several months living like prisoners in their own home, constantly checking their security and worrying about when the next strike would come. But as the weeks turned into months, the anonymous phone calls suddenly stopped. By the summer of 2009, Michael and Dahlia began to believe that the danger had finally passed. They started to relax, focus on their business, and try to enjoy their new marriage. They had no idea that the mastermind behind the entire plot had not given up at all. In fact, she had decided that planting drugs was not working fast enough. She had decided to move on to a much more permanent and deadly solution. On the morning of the 5th of August, 2009, Dahlia woke up at 5:45 in the morning, leaving Michael sleeping soundly in their bed. She put on her gym clothes and drove to her local fitness center. At around 6:30 in the morning, while Dahlia was working out on one of the treadmills, she checked her cell phone and saw that she had a missed call from an unfamiliar phone number. She called her voicemail and listened to the message. Her heart began to race as she heard the voice of a detective from the Boynton Beach Police Department. The detective told her that there had been a major incident at her condominium and that she needed to return home immediately. Terrified, Dahlia ran out of the gym, got into her car, and sped toward her neighborhood. As she drove, she called the detective back to find out what was going on. The detective refused to give her any details over the phone, saying only that the situation involved her husband and that he would explain everything when she arrived. When Dahlia turned onto her street, she was met with a massive police presence. There were patrol cars with their lights flashing, crime scene vans, and yellow police tape blocking off the entire front of her home. Forensic investigators were walking around her lawn, and photographers were taking pictures of her front door. Dahlia parked her car and was immediately approached by a police officer who led her past the tape toward the detective. The detective met Dahlia with a somber expression on his face. He looked at her and said very calmly and directly that they had received a report of a disturbance inside her condo earlier that morning. He told her that shots had been fired, and he was deeply sorry to inform her that her husband, Michael, had been killed. The moment the detective said those words, Dahlia collapsed into a state of pure hysteria. She began to scream, cry, and throw herself onto the detective, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked like a woman whose entire world had just been shattered in an instant. The police officers on the scene gently guided her to a nearby patrol car to calm her down, while crime scene photographers continued to document the area. What Dahlia did not know was that this entire scene was a massive, carefully orchestrated setup. The television show Cops was in town filming with the Boynton Beach Police Department, and their camera crews were hidden nearby in the bushes, capturing every single second of her dramatic reaction. The police then drove Dahlia to the station and placed her in a standard interrogation room, telling her they needed to ask her some questions to help find her husband's killer. In the quiet interrogation room, Dahlia sat crying, wiping her eyes with tissues as the detective tried to comfort her. He told her that they needed to act quickly to catch the murderer, and he asked her if she had any idea who would want to harm Michael. Dahlia immediately began to steer the conversation toward Michael's criminal past. She brought up his old ties to the Bonanno crime family and the victims of his boiler room scams. She suggested that one of these dangerous criminals must have finally tracked him down and executed him. The detective listened patiently, taking detailed notes on everything she said. But after a few minutes, the detective stopped writing. He leaned forward, looked Dahlia dead in the eyes, and told her that they needed to get to the truth. He asked her if she recognized a specific man. Before Dahlia could answer, the door to the interrogation room opened, and a large, heavily built man in handcuffs was escorted into the room. The detective asked Dahlia if she had ever seen this man before. Dahlia looked at him, shook her head with a look of confusion, and insisted that she had never seen him in her entire life. The truth was that Dahlia knew exactly who the man was, and she was the mastermind behind the entire plot. Almost immediately after marrying Michael, Dahlia had managed to transfer $200,000 of his money into her own accounts. But she was not satisfied with just a portion of his wealth. She wanted the entire condo, his business, and every single dollar he owned. To get it, she had spent months trying to frame him. She was the one who had made the anonymous phone calls to the police, and she was the one who had personally snuck into his trunk to plant the bag of cocaine under his spare tire. But when the police chose not to arrest Michael, her plan to send him to prison failed. That was when she decided to take more extreme measures. She reached out to an old ex-boyfriend of hers and asked him if he knew anyone who could act as a hitman to murder her husband. The ex-boyfriend was shocked by the request. He initially tried to laugh it off, but Dahlia kept calling him, offering to pay a large amount of money and making it clear that she was completely serious. Terrified of what she was planning to do, the ex-boyfriend went straight to the police and exposed her. The Boynton Beach Police Department immediately launched an undercover investigation to catch Dahlia in the act. They had one of their own undercover detectives pose as a professional contract killer. The ex-boyfriend arranged a meeting between Dahlia and the fake hitman in a parked car outside a local CVS store. What Dahlia did not realize was that the police had packed the car with hidden video cameras and microphones, recording her every word and action. During the meeting, Dahlia spoke with chilling calm about how she wanted her husband dead. She agreed to pay the hitman $1,200 to shoot Michael in their condo while she was away at the gym. She even handed over a cash deposit to seal the deal. Before she got out of the car, the undercover officer wanted to make absolutely certain that she would not change her mind. He looked at her and asked if she was 5,000% sure she wanted to go through with this, reminding her that once he pulled the trigger, there was no going back. Dahlia looked him in the eyes and replied that when she says she is going to do something, she does it, and that she was completely sure about her decision. Armed with this absolute proof of her intent to commit murder, the police decided to use Dahlia's own plan against her. On the morning of August 5, as soon as Dahlia left the condo to go to the gym, a team of police officers rushed inside. They woke up Michael and showed him the undercover video of his wife hiring a hitman to murder him. Michael was completely devastated and betrayed, but he agreed to help the police with their operation. The police took Michael to a safe location, and then they quickly set up a highly convincing fake crime scene outside the condo. They put up the yellow tape, brought in the forensic vans, and made the home look exactly like a double homicide scene. Then, the detective called Dahlia at the gym, prompting her to rush back and give her dramatic performance for the hidden cops' television cameras. Back at the police station, after Dahlia denied knowing the handcuffed hitman, the detective decided it was time to end the lies. He looked at her and told her that the man in handcuffs was actually an undercover officer and that their entire meeting in the car had been recorded on video. He told her that she was under arrest for solicitation of first-degree murder. Dahlia immediately began to panic, shaking her head and crying that she had not done anything wrong and that she did not understand what was happening. She kept telling them that there was a major mistake and that they had the wrong person. But the detective was not finished with his surprises. He looked at her and told her that her husband, Michael, was actually alive and well and that he was currently standing right outside the door of the room. The police then walked Michael past the open glass window of the interrogation room door so Dahlia could see him with her own eyes. When Dahlia saw Michael walking down the hallway, completely unharmed and healthy, she began to scream his name through the glass, begging him to come inside and talk to her. But Michael refused to look at her. He kept walking down the corridor, completely done with the woman who had tried to have him brutally killed. Following her dramatic arrest, the legal battle that ensued became one of the most widely followed and sensationalized court cases in the history of South Florida. Dahlia was officially charged with solicitation to commit first-degree murder, a charge that carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. Her defense team, realizing that the physical evidence against her was absolutely overwhelming due to the undercover video, decided to present an incredibly bizarre and unconventional defense. They claimed that the entire murder-for-hire plot was never actually real. Instead, they argued that Dahlia and Michael were both working together on a public relations stunt in an attempt to land their own reality television show. The defense attorneys claimed that the couple had written a script together and that Dahlia's meeting with the fake hitman was simply an audition tape designed to generate viral attention and get them a contract with a major television network. They argued that Michael was fully aware of the plan the entire time and was simply playing his part in the stunt. However, this defense strategy quickly fell apart when the prosecution put Michael on the stand. Michael testified under oath that he had absolutely no idea his wife was trying to have him killed. He described the utter horror of sitting in the police station and watching his own wife negotiate the price of his life on an undercover video. He explained that he had genuinely loved Dahlia and had believed they were building a future together, only to realize that she had been manipulating him from the very beginning. The prosecution also presented the ex-boyfriend who had tipped off the police, as well as the undercover detective who had recorded the meeting. The jury did not buy the defense's reality television show explanation for a single second. In 2011, after a highly publicized trial, the jury found Dahlia guilty of solicitation to commit first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced her to 20 years in state prison. But the legal drama was far from over. Dahlia's defense team immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the intense media coverage and the selection of the jury had biased the trial against her. In 2014, an appeals court agreed and threw out her conviction, ordering a brand new trial. Dahlia was released on house arrest while she waited for her second trial to begin, wearing an electronic ankle monitor that tracked her every move. In 2016, the second trial took place, and this time her defense team tried a completely different strategy. They claimed that the Boynton Beach Police Department had acted improperly by setting her up and tactically coercing her into the murder-for-hire plot just so they could get featured on the highly popular national television show Cops. The defense argued that the police department was much more interested in getting good ratings and national fame on television than conducting a fair, unbiased, and ethical investigation. This argument succeeded in creating enough confusion and doubt in the minds of some jurors to result in a hung jury, with the panel split 9-3 in favor of guilt, meaning they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. This meant that the state had to prepare to try her for a third time. The third trial began in the summer of 2017. This time, the prosecution focused heavily on Dahlia's own words and actions captured in the undercover videos, emphasizing her absolute lack of hesitation when the fake hitman gave her multiple opportunities to back out. After hearing all the evidence and deliberating for just a few hours, the third jury found her guilty once again. This time, the judge sentenced her to 16 years in state prison, which she would serve at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. For Michael DiPolito, the final conclusion of these long and grueling trials brought a mixture of immense relief and lingering emotional pain. He had miraculously survived a highly calculated attempt on his life by the person he trusted most in the world, but the emotional scars of the betrayal were incredibly deep. In the years following the trials, Michael focused heavily on rebuilding his life and his marketing business. He spoke openly in several national television interviews about the psychological impact of the ordeal, describing how difficult it was to ever trust another human being after knowing that his own wife had slept next to him while secretly planning his execution. He expressed deep gratitude for the dedicated police officers who had saved his life, and he tried his best to move on from the sensationalized media circus that had surrounded his entire marriage. He had to rebuild his finances as well, as Dahlia had successfully drained a significant portion of his hard-earned savings during their short time together. Despite this massive betrayal, Michael managed to stay sober and continue running his digital marketing firm, proving that he was resilient enough to survive both his criminal past and the deadly plot of his former wife. The case of Dahlia remains one of the most famous true crime stories in modern American history, mostly because of how much of it was captured on film. The video of Dahlia crying hysterically at the fake crime scene, contrasted with her cold and calculated behavior in the undercover sting car, is still widely viewed and analyzed by criminologists and crime fans around the world. It serves as a stark and chilling reminder of the terrifying power of deception and greed. Dahlia believed she could orchestrate the perfect crime and walk away with everything her husband owned, but her own arrogance and willingness to trust an undercover officer ultimately led to her downfall. Today, she remains behind bars, serving her 16-year sentence in a Florida state prison. The story leaves a haunting question for everyone who hears it, a reminder of the hidden dangers that can sometimes lurk behind a charming smile. It forces us to ask ourselves how well we truly know the people we share our homes and our lives with, and what they might be capable of when the cameras are not rolling. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.